Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Robert Johnson, and I need to share what happened to me back in 2009. Though even now the memories make my hands shake as I type this. I was 24 then, fresh out of college with a business degree and big dreams that somehow led me to accept a position that paid barely above minimum wage. The job was at Camp Brookfield, a summer camp hidden away in the dense Vermont woods, the kind of place that looks idyllic on brochures with its rustic cabins and sparkling lakes, but holds darker secrets beneath its peaceful facade. I took the job partly because I needed work, but mostly because my two closest friends from college, Kyle Fuchs and Max Durand, had also signed on as counselors. We saw it as one last adventure before diving into the corporate world, a chance to extend our carefree college days just a little longer. Growing up, I'd spent countless weekends camping and hiking with my family, so I figured this would be a breeze. Just a summer of fun with my buddies, watching over some kids, and getting paid to basically relive our own childhood camp experiences. Looking back, I want to shake my naive younger self, warn him about what was coming, tell him to run as far from Camp Brookfield as he could. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths, and none of us could have predicted the nightmare that would unfold in those woods. The camp itself was run by Carl Remington, a gruff, weather-beaten man who'd been there so long he seemed as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pines that surrounded us. Carl was the kind of old-school authority figure you don't see much anymore. He chain-smoked cheap cigars, kept a flask of whiskey in his office drawer, though he thought we didn't know about it, and ran the camp with military precision. Despite his gruff exterior, you could tell he genuinely loved the place and its traditions. He'd start each morning by raising the flag himself, rain or shine, and end each day by personally checking every cabin before turning in. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of the camp's history, having started as a camper himself in the 1960s. Worked his way up through every possible position, and finally taken over as director in the mid-90s. Carl's dedication to the camp was almost religious in its intensity, which made what happened that summer even more devastating. The first few weeks were exactly what we'd expected. Long, sun-drenched days filled with the sounds of children laughing, splashing in the lake, and singing off-key around campfires. Kyle, ever the entertainer, would regale the kids with increasingly elaborate ghost stories each night, while Max and I would sneak around in the darkness, making spooky noises to enhance the atmosphere. It was exactly the kind of summer job we'd hoped for, right up until the moment it wasn't. The night everything changed started like any other. It was mid-July, and the air was thick with humidity and the buzz of mosquitoes. We were gathered around the main campfire pit, where Kyle was in the middle of telling his favorite story about the phantom of Camp Brookfield, a tale he'd completely fabricated about a former counselor who'd gone mad and now haunted the woods looking for victims. The kids were hanging on his every word, faces illuminated by the dancing flames, when we heard it, a scream that turned our blood to ice. It wasn't like the playful screams we'd grown used to hearing during games or swimming sessions. This was primal, filled with genuine terror, and it came from the direction of the lake. Carl was on his feet before the echo had died away, barking orders with the authority that broke through our initial paralysis. "Blake, Kyle, Max, get to the lake now. Everyone else, stay here." We took off running through the trees, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we struggled to navigate the familiar path that suddenly seemed alien in the darkness. The sound of our heavy breathing and pounding footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the still night air, and I remember thinking that something felt fundamentally wrong, like we'd crossed some invisible boundary into a darker reality. When we reached the lake's edge, we found Timmy Harrison, one of our youngest campers, standing alone at the water's edge. He was soaking wet, shivering despite the warm night, and his face held an expression I'll never forget, a look of such pure horror that it seemed to age him 10 years. "What happened, Timmy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my heart hammered against my ribs. His response, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Ethan, he just went under. We were swimming and then he just disappeared." What followed was a nightmare of bureaucracy and increasing dread. The police came, of course, with their boats and their divers and their dogs. They searched the lake for 3 days straight but found nothing, no body, no evidence, not even a trace of struggle. Ethan Walsh, age 11, had simply vanished as if he'd never existed at all. His parents arrived within hours of being notified, their faces drawn with worry that would later transform into anger and accusations. The other parents started calling, demanding answers we couldn't give, and within a week, half our campers had been pulled out. Those who remained moved through the camp like ghosts, jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers. Carl tried to maintain order, implementing new safety protocols and doubling up on supervision duties, but you could see the toll it was taking on him. He stopped smoking his cigars, and the flask in his drawer emptied faster than ever. The woods that had once seemed friendly and familiar now loomed over us like silent sentinels, hiding who knew what in their depths. We counselors tried to keep spirits up, but the strain was showing on all of us. Kyle stopped telling his ghost stories, and Max developed a nervous habit of constantly checking and rechecking the locks on the cabin doors. I barely slept, lying awake at night listening to the sounds of the forest and wondering if somewhere out there, Ethan was still alive. The discovery of the shoe changed everything. Max and I were doing our nightly perimeter check, a new requirement Carl had implemented after Ethan's disappearance, when we found it half buried in the underbrush about 50 yards from the lake. It was a child's sneaker, caked with mud, and torn as if it had been removed with considerable force, and we both recognized it immediately as the type Ethan had been wearing the night he vanished. The police returned with renewed vigor, combing the woods with cadaver dogs and teams of volunteers, but again found nothing. The shoe became a source of endless speculation among the remaining campers and staff. Some thought it proved Ethan had been attacked by an animal, though there were no predators in the area large enough to take a child. Others suggested he'd been kidnapped, but there had been no ransom demands, no evidence of an intruder. Kyle developed a theory that there were old mine shafts in the woods, hidden by years of growth, and that Ethan had fallen into one. He spent his free time researching the area's mining history, becoming increasingly obsessed with finding an explanation that made sense. But none of us were prepared for what happened next, when Kyle himself disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an empty cabin and a half-finished letter to his parents on his bunk. The night Kyle vanished marked the beginning of the end for Camp Brookfield. Parents descended en masse to collect their children, and most of the staff quit on the spot. Carl aged years in a matter of days, his hair seeming to turn whiter by the hour as he dealt with police, parents, and the media circus that had begun to descend on our once peaceful camp. Only Max and I stayed on, driven by a desperate need to find our friend and uncover the truth about what was happening in these woods. We spent our nights searching, following every trail and checking every abandoned structure we could find. We interviewed locals, dug through old newspapers at the town library, and created elaborate maps marking every unusual occurrence or unexplained sound. Our investigation led us down countless dead ends and wild theories, but nothing prepared us for what we found that moonlit night by the lake. The figure we saw standing on the opposite shore seemed human at first glance, but there was something wrong about its proportions, something that made your mind rebel at trying to process exactly what you were seeing. When we found Kyle's boot lying on the ground where the figure had stood, we knew we were finally on the right track, though we couldn't have imagined the horrors that discovery would lead us to. The abandoned cabin we eventually found deep in the woods was something out of a nightmare, a place that shouldn't have existed in our modern, civilized world. The rusty chains bolted to the walls, the scratches in the floorboards that looked disturbingly like they'd been made by human fingernails, the horrible metallic smell that permeated everything. It was all too real, too terrible to process. Finding Kyle there, barely alive and changed in ways that went beyond his physical injuries, was both the best and worst moment of my life. He survived, technically, but the Kyle we knew died in that cabin. He never returned to his old job at the accounting firm he'd lined up before that summer, never married his college sweetheart as he'd planned. Instead, he moved back in with his parents, rarely leaves the house, and refuses to talk about what happened during those missing days. The police never caught the man we saw, though similar sightings have been reported at other camps across New England. Every few years another child goes missing in the woods, another abandoned cabin is found, but the perpetrator remains a shadow, a nightmare that slips away just as the authorities think they're closing in. Camp Brookfield closed its doors forever that August. Carl sold the property to a developer who had plans to turn it into a luxury resort, but those plans fell through when the construction crews refused to work there, claiming they heard screams in the woods and saw strange figures moving through the trees at dusk. The buildings still stand, slowly rotting back into the forest that seems eager to reclaim them. Max and I tried to move on with our lives, but some experiences mark you forever. We keep in touch, linked by memories we'd rather forget, but can't escape. Sometimes late at night I'll wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear a child screaming in the distance, or I'll catch a glimpse of a tall, gaunt figure in my peripheral vision that vanishes when I turn to look. I've learned to live with these ghosts, but I often wonder about Ethan. Did he suffer? Is he still out there somewhere, another victim of the monster we glimpsed in those woods? And how many other camps harbor similar secrets? How many other children have vanished without a trace while their counselors told ghost stories around the campfire? I don't know the answers to these questions, and maybe it's better that way. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left closed. But I do know this. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones we tell around the campfire. They're the ones we live through, the ones that change us forever, the ones that remind us that the real monsters aren't supernatural beings or urban legends, but something far more terrifying, human beings whose minds have twisted into shapes we can barely comprehend. Last year I received a letter from Carl Remington. His handwriting was shaky, nothing like the bold strokes I remembered from his days signing camp documents, and the contents of his letter chilled me to the bone. He was dying, he wrote, and needed to unburden himself of secrets he'd carried for decades. I drove up to Vermont to see him, finding him in a small nursing home on the outskirts of Burlington. The strong, commanding presence I remembered had been reduced to a frail figure in a wheelchair, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence I remembered. What he told me over the next few hours made me question everything I thought I knew about Camp Brookfield. The camp, it turned out, had a history far darker than any of Kyle's campfire stories. Carl had inherited more than just the property when he took over as director. He'd inherited a legacy of disappearances stretching back to the 1950s. Every 20 years or so, children would vanish without a trace. The previous directors had covered it up, attributing the disappearances to drownings, wild animal attacks, or runaways. Carl showed me a journal he'd kept hidden all these years, documenting not just Ethan's disappearance, but others. Michael Thompson in 1989, Jenny Chen in 1969, Robert Maxwell in 1949. Each case followed the same pattern. A child would vanish near the lake, followed by a counselor or staff member disappearing while investigating. Some were found alive, like Kyle. Others were never seen again. The man we'd seen in the woods, Carl believed, wasn't working alone. He described a sort of cult that had operated in the area since the camp's founding, using the remote location and steady supply of vulnerable victims for their own twisted purposes. The cabin we'd found was just one of many scattered throughout the dense Vermont forests. Carl had spent years after the camp's closure trying to track them down, working with a small group of dedicated investigators and survivors from other camps. They'd mapped out a pattern of disappearances across New England, all connected by similar details: abandoned cabins, gaunt figures in the woods, children vanishing without a trace. Max flew in from Seattle when I called him about Carl's revelations. We spent a week going through the old man's research, piecing together a puzzle that spanned generations. The deeper we dug, the more connections we found. Other camps that had closed under mysterious circumstances. Local legends about strange lights in the woods. Missing persons cases that had gone cold decades ago. It was like pulling on a loose thread and watching an entire sweater unravel. The truth was far more terrifying than anything we'd imagined that summer. Carl passed away 2 days after we finished going through his files. At his funeral, I noticed several attendees who seemed out of place, people who watched the proceedings with too keen eyes and stood just a little too straight. One of them, a woman in her 60s, approached me afterward. She introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, a former camper from 1969 who'd witnessed Jenny Chen's disappearance. She was part of a network of survivors and investigators who'd been tracking these incidents for years. They had evidence suggesting the cult was still active, still operating out of remote camps and wilderness areas across the Northeast. That's when I made a decision that would change my life again. Max and I joined Sarah's network. We now spend our free time investigating reports of missing children at summer camps, working with local authorities and other survivors to try and prevent what happened at Camp Brookfield from happening again. We've had some successes. 3 potential disappearances prevented this past year alone, but also many frustrating dead ends. The cult seems to have gone even deeper underground, adapting their methods to avoid detection. Last month we got a lead about another camp in Maine where children had reported seeing strange figures in the woods. Max and I went to investigate, and though we didn't find anything concrete, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A tall, gaunt figure standing between the trees, watching the children play. By the time I grabbed my camera, it was gone, but I know what I saw, and I know our work isn't done. I sometimes drive past Camp Brookfield late at night. The buildings are almost completely reclaimed by nature now, the once clear paths choked with undergrowth. But on certain nights when the moon is full and the wind is still, you can see lights moving through the old campgrounds. The locals say it's just teenagers exploring the abandoned buildings, but I know better. The evil that took root there decades ago hasn't died. It's just waiting, patient as the trees themselves, for another chance to claim its next victim. Kyle called me recently, the first time he's reached out in years. His voice was shaky, but he had something important to tell me. He'd started remembering more about his time in that cabin, details he'd blocked out. He talked about chants in strange languages, about figures in robes, about plans they had for the children they took. He's agreed to work with our network, sharing what he knows to help prevent other abductions. It's clearly difficult for him, but he says he's tired of living in fear. Ethan's parents still hold out hope that someday they'll find out what happened to their son. They've never given up, never stopped searching. Every few years they hire new private investigators, follow up on new leads, but always hit the same wall of silence. I haven't told them about what Carl revealed. Some truths are too horrible to share. But I keep searching, we all do. Sarah's network grows larger every year, as more survivors come forward and more investigators join our cause. This isn't the kind of story that has a neat, happy ending. The monsters are still out there, still hunting. But they're not as invisible as they once were. We know their patterns now, their methods, and while we may never bring back those we've lost, we can honor their memories by protecting others from the same fate. So if you're planning to send your child to summer camp, do your research. Look for the patterns. And if you see a tall, gaunt figure watching from the trees, don't dismiss it as your imagination. Some ghosts are all too real, and some stories don't end just because we stop telling them. That's the full truth of what happened at Camp Brookfield, at least as much as I understand it. I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, hearing phantom screams echo across a lake that's now choked with weeds. But I don't run from those nightmares anymore. They drive me to keep searching, keep investigating, keep fighting, because somewhere in those dark woods, the truth is still waiting to be found. And maybe, just maybe, we can stop this from happening to anyone else. My name is James Martinez, and the events I'm about to share happened to me back in 1994, though they feel as fresh as yesterday. The memories surface in quiet moments, like ripples in a still lake, bringing with them the musty scent of pine needles and the flickering shadows of a nightmare I can't quite shake. I was 19 then, a sophomore at Michigan State University, looking for a way to spend my summer that didn't involve waiting tables or stocking shelves. When I saw the posting for a counselor position at Camp Willowbrook, it seemed like the perfect opportunity, a chance to make some money while enjoying the pristine wilderness of northern Michigan. The job listing painted an idyllic picture, a sprawling summer camp nestled among ancient pines, with crystal-clear lakes, hiking trails, and the promise of adventure. I figured it would be straightforward enough: supervise some kids, lead some activities, and spend my evenings around the campfire sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Looking back now, I realize how naive that assumption was. The first few weeks lived up to every summer camp movie I'd ever seen. The staff quickly became like family, each person bringing their own unique flavor to our little community. There was Rocco DiMaggio, a burly guy from Brooklyn who wore his heart on his sleeve and had an endless supply of increasingly terrible jokes. He worked as the camp's maintenance supervisor, but he spent more time entertaining the kids with his outlandish stories than fixing things. His thick New York accent and booming laugh became the soundtrack of our days. Then there was Candace Chen, our camp nurse and my co-counselor for the older kids. She was quiet but razor-sharp, studying pre-med at Johns Hopkins, and approaching every scraped knee and bout of homesickness with the same careful attention she'd give a major surgery. The way she could calm a panicked child with just a few soft words was nothing short of miraculous. Jake Thompson, the camp director, was an old friend from high school who'd worked his way up from junior counselor over the years. He knew every inch of Camp Willowbrook like it was an extension of himself. Every creaky floorboard in the mess hall, every hidden fishing spot along the lake, every tree perfect for climbing. His dedication to the camp was obvious in the way he'd spend hours planning activities, making sure every kid had the chance to discover something new about themselves. We'd drift apart in the years following that summer, but back then his enthusiasm was infectious, making even the most mundane tasks feel like part of some grand adventure. The campers themselves were a diverse bunch, ranging from 8 to 15 years old, each carrying their own stories and dreams. Some were returning for their 5th or 6th summer, while others were experiencing their first time away from home. We dealt with the usual array of summer camp dramas: homesickness, cabin rivalries, first crushes, and the occasional midnight raid on the kitchen's cookie supplies. There were scraped knees from overambitious hikes, tears from failed archery attempts, and more than a few pranks involving fake spiders in sleeping bags. But these were the kind of problems we'd been trained to handle, the expected ripples in otherwise smooth waters. Matthew "Matty" Sullivan was different from the start. At 15, he was one of our oldest campers, and while most kids his age formed tight-knit groups, Matty preferred solitude. He wasn't antisocial. He'd participate in activities when required and was unfailingly polite, but there was something in his eyes that seemed older than his years. He spent most of his free time sketching in a worn notebook, creating intricate drawings of the woods and lakes around camp. I'd catch glimpses of his work sometimes, detailed renderings of twisted trees and shadowy figures that showed remarkable talent, but carried an undercurrent of darkness that was unusual for a kid his age. Looking back, I wonder if he somehow sensed what was coming. The day Matty disappeared started like any other. It was mid-July, and the air was thick with humidity, the kind of summer day where even breathing feels like work. The morning activities went smoothly: swimming lessons at the lake, arts and crafts in the shade of the mess hall's wide porch, nature walks along the marked trails. Matty had been quieter than usual, but that wasn't particularly unusual for him. It wasn't until dinner that alarm bells started ringing. The mess hall was always chaotic during meals, with kids shouting across tables and counselors trying to maintain some semblance of order. At first, no one noticed the empty seat at table 6, but when the dinner crowd started to thin and Matty still hadn't appeared, the first tendrils of worry began to creep in. We initiated our missing camper protocol immediately, though we tried to keep the mood light to avoid panicking the other kids. Counselors spread out across the campgrounds, checking every cabin, every bathroom, every possible hiding spot. I remember calling his name until my voice was hoarse, the sound echoing off the trees and coming back empty. The sun was setting by the time we had to admit that Matty wasn't anywhere within the camp boundaries. Jake made the difficult call to notify the local police, and soon the quiet evening was filled with the harsh glare of flashlights and the crackle of police radios. The investigation that followed was thorough but frustrating. The police found no signs of struggle, no evidence of where Matty might have gone. His belongings were still in his cabin, including his precious sketchbook, which now seemed filled with an even more ominous energy. The last person to see him had been his bunkmate, who remembered Matty saying he was going to the bathroom after lunch. After that, it was as if he'd simply vanished into the thick Michigan air. The police interviewed everyone, staff, campers, even the weekly delivery drivers, but no one could provide any useful information. They explored every possibility, running away, drowning, animal attack, but nothing fit. Matty had simply ceased to exist. Jake handled the situation as well as anyone could, organizing grief counseling sessions and maintaining open communication with the parents. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. The easy smile that had been his trademark was replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a constant furrow in his brow. He spent hours on the phone with Matty's parents, the police, and the camp's insurance company, trying to hold everything together while our perfect summer crumbled around us. We implemented new safety measures, buddy systems for everything, hourly head counts, expanded staff patrols. The carefree atmosphere of early summer was replaced by a heavy vigilance. The younger kids picked up on the tension, becoming clingy and nervous. The older ones whispered theories among themselves, each more outlandish than the last. But none of us was prepared for what happened next. Lisa Chen, no relation to Candace, disappeared exactly 1 week after Matty. She was 13, a first-time camper who'd finally convinced her parents to let her come to sleepaway camp. Unlike Matty's mysterious daytime vanishing, Lisa's disappearance came in the dead of night. Her cabin mates reported hearing footsteps outside their window, but such sounds were common in a woods full of wildlife. It wasn't until morning head count that they realized Lisa's bed hadn't been slept in. The second disappearance hit the camp like a thunderbolt. This time there was no pretending it might be a coincidence or a runaway situation. Parents descended on the camp in a panic, and within days our population had dwindled to less than half its original size. Those who remained did so mainly because their parents couldn't arrange immediate transportation or had no other child care options. The police established a permanent presence at camp, with officers patrolling the grounds 24/7. The local news picked up the story, and soon our quiet little camp was the center of a media circus. The night everything came to a head started ordinarily enough. I was on patrol with Rocco, both of us armed with heavy flashlights and walkie-talkies. The police had their own patrols going, but we maintained our staff watches as well, partly to reassure the remaining campers and partly because we felt responsible for protecting what was left of our summer family. The night was oppressively warm, the air so thick you could almost drink it. The moon was full, casting strange shadows through the canopy of leaves above us. Around midnight, Rocco and I split up to cover more ground. I was near the archery range when his voice crackled over the walkie-talkie, tight with urgency. "James, get over here now, by the nature trail entrance. There's something you need to see." The fear in his voice made my blood run cold. I ran toward his location, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly across the ground. I found Rocco at the edge of the woods, his face pale in the moonlight. Without speaking, he pointed into the trees. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then a faint glow caught my eye. It was different from our flashlights or the police searchlights. Warmer, more organic, like an old oil lamp. It moved slowly through the trees, as if being carried by someone who knew exactly where they were going. Looking back, I wonder why we didn't radio for the police immediately. Maybe it was the surreal nature of the moment, or perhaps some misguided sense of responsibility. Whatever the reason, we found ourselves following that light into the woods, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. The sounds of the camp faded away until all we could hear was our own breathing and the soft crunch of leaves under our feet. The light led us to a small clearing, and what we saw there will haunt me until the day I die. An old well lantern hung from a low branch, its flame casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. Beneath it stood a man who seemed to have stepped out of a nightmare. He was impossibly tall and thin, like a tree that had somehow learned to walk. His clothes were filthy and torn, hanging from his frame in tatters. His hair and beard were long and matted, full of leaves and twigs as if he'd been living in the woods for years. But it was his eyes that struck me the most. They gleamed in the lantern light with an intelligence that was somehow worse than madness. What happened next is a blur in my memory, a series of snapshots filled with violence and terror. The man had a knife, its blade catching the lantern light as he moved. Rocco, brave, foolish Rocco tried to tackle him and got a deep slash across his arm for his troubles. I remember the sight of blood, black in the dim light, and the sound of Rocco's cry of pain. Then the man was on me, his strength surprising given his emaciated appearance. The knife pressed against my throat, and his breath was hot and rancid on my face as he demanded to know where the kids were. In that moment I understood with horrible clarity that we'd found our answer to the disappearances. This man, this creature of the woods, had been watching us, studying our routines, waiting for his chances. The thought of Maddie and Lisa in his hands made me sick. What had happened to them? Were they still alive somewhere in these woods? The confrontation ended as suddenly as it began. A shout from the direction of the camp. One of the police officers must have spotted the lantern light, startled the man just enough for me to break free. Rocco, despite his injury, managed to tackle him to the ground. I ran for help, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted back toward the camp. By the time I returned with the police, it was over. They found the man unconscious, Rocco sitting nearby, pale from blood loss but alive. The aftermath unfolded like a bad dream. The man was taken into custody, but he never revealed what had happened to Maddie and Lisa. Despite extensive searches of the woods, no trace of them was ever found. The man himself was deemed unfit to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric facility. We learned later that he'd been a former camp counselor himself, at a different camp that had closed down decades ago. Something had broken in him, and he'd been living in the woods ever since, watching summer after summer as new children came to his forest. Camp Willowbrook never recovered. The remaining campers were sent home, and the camp closed permanently shortly after. The property was sold to developers who turned it into a luxury resort, erasing most traces of what had happened there. Jake moved out west, unable to shake the guilt of what had happened under his watch. Rocco recovered from his wound but left Michigan altogether, heading back to New York where the forests weren't quite so deep. Candace finished medical school and became a successful pediatrician, though she never worked at a summer camp again. As for me, I tried to move on. I finished college, started a career in marketing, got married, and had kids of my own. But some part of me remains in those woods, forever 19 and terrified, watching a lantern light move through the trees. I've never told my children this story, and they've never gone to summer camp. When they ask why, I make up excuses about expense or logistics. How could I explain that their father is still haunted by the memory of a lantern's glow, and the knowledge that sometimes the monsters in the woods are all too real? Years have passed, but I still sometimes dream of Camp Willowbrook. In my dreams, I'm walking through those woods again, following that flickering light, but this time I find Maddie and Lisa. They're sitting around a campfire, safe and sound, and they look up at me with relieved smiles. But then I wake up, and the truth settles back in like a heavy blanket. Some mysteries remain unsolved, some wounds never fully heal, and some summers never really end. Every now and then I check the news from northern Michigan, searching for any mention of remains found in the woods or new evidence in old disappearances. So far, there's been nothing. The man who attacked us died in the psychiatric facility 5 years ago, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. Sometimes I wonder if that's better, if knowing the full truth would be worse than the uncertainty we live with now. The resort that replaced Camp Willowbrook is successful, I hear. Families go there to enjoy the same lakes and woods where we once played and laughed and later searched in desperate fear. I wonder if any of them feel it, that lingering darkness beneath the surface of such natural beauty. I wonder if, on particularly still nights, they might see a faint light moving through the trees, like a memory that refuses to fade into history. These days, when I see a lantern, whether in a camping store or at a garden party, I find myself holding my breath for just a moment. In that brief pause, I'm transported back to that clearing in the woods, face to face with a nightmare made flesh. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the unknown monsters lurking in the shadows, but the broken humans who walk among us, carrying their own darkness like a torch in the night. I've told this story only a handful of times over the years, and never in such detail before. Perhaps it's time to share this burden, to let others understand why I still jump at unexpected sounds in the dark, why I can't bring myself to go camping, why the sight of a lantern still makes my heart race. Because while the events at Camp Willowbrook may have ended, their echo continues to ripple through time, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. And so here I sit 30 years later, still carrying the weight of that summer. The world has changed dramatically since 1994, but some things remain constant. The darkness of the woods at night, the flicker of a flame in the distance, and the knowledge that sometimes the most innocent places can harbor the deepest shadows. To Maddie and Lisa, wherever they are, I hope they found peace. To Rocco, Candace, and Jake, I hope they've managed to move forward better than I have. And to anyone reading this who might recognize something familiar in these words, remember that while darkness exists in this world, so does light. Just be careful which lights you choose to follow into the wood. My name is Thomas Wilson, and this all happened during one unforgettable summer I spent as a camp counselor at Camp Brookside. Before I dive into the events that would forever change my life, I should tell you a bit about myself. I'm what most would consider a pretty normal guy. I work as a mechanic in a small town where everybody knows everybody else, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a tree again. But every summer I trade in my wrench for a whistle and head up to Camp Brookside to serve as a counselor. It's one of those quintessential summer camps you see in movies, all log cabins and towering pine trees nestled against a pristine lake in upstate New York, where the air always seems cleaner and time moves a little slower. I'm not married, and I don't have any kids of my own, but working with children has always been something that brings me joy. Maybe it's because I'm still a big kid at heart. I can get just as excited about a perfectly toasted marshmallow or a well-built fort as any 12-year-old. The kids at camp seem to sense this about me, and it's probably why they tend to gravitate toward me, sharing their secrets and their dreams with a trust that I've always considered sacred. That particular summer started like any other. The air was heavy with the scent of pine needles and lake water, carrying the excited chatter of children as they tumbled out of their parents' cars, laden with overstuffed duffel bags and sleeping bags. I was assigned to Cabin 7, home to a group of 12-year-old boys who would be under my care for the next 8 weeks. The first day was a whirlwind of activity, helping kids claim bunks, sorting through lost socks, mediating minor disputes over who got the top bunk, and trying to memorize a dozen new names and faces. Mr. Caldwell, our camp director, gave his traditional welcome speech by the main fire pit that evening, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd as he shared the rich history of Camp Brookside, outlined the summer's activities, and reviewed the all-important camp rules. His gray hair caught the firelight as he spoke, making him look almost ethereal in the gathering dusk. Everything seemed normal at first, but things began to take a strange turn about a week into the session. There was this new kid in my cabin, Mason Reynolds, who stood out from the others in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. He had a mess of curly black hair that seemed to defy gravity, and these striking blue eyes that felt like they could see right through you. While the other boys would be roughhousing or telling ghost stories after lights out, Mason would often sit quietly on his bunk, writing in a worn notebook he kept tucked under his pillow. The other kids noticed his difference too, and some of them started picking on him. Nothing too severe, but enough that I kept a watchful eye on the situation. One night, as I was making my final rounds before turning in, I spotted Mason standing at the edge of the lake. The moon was full that night, casting a silver path across the dark water, and Mason's silhouette looked almost otherworldly against the backdrop of stars. "Hey, Mason," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. "It's pretty late, you should be in bed." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence, just kept staring out at the water as if mesmerized by something I couldn't see. When I approached and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, I could feel him trembling slightly despite the warm summer air. "Everything okay, buddy?" I asked, crouching down to his level. That's when he finally turned to look at me, his blue eyes seeming to glow in the moonlight. "I think someone's out there," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. I followed his gaze out across the lake but saw nothing except the moon's reflection dancing on the water's surface. "Come on," I said, trying to sound reassuring while fighting back my own growing sense of unease. "Let's get you back to the cabin. There's nothing out there." But Mason's strange behavior that night was just the beginning. A few nights later, he woke me from a dead sleep, his small hand shaking my shoulder urgently. "Mr. Wilson," he whispered, those unnaturally blue eyes wide with fear. "Someone's crying. Can't you hear it?" I sat up, straining my ears in the darkness of the cabin. The only sounds were the gentle snores of the other boys and the distant call of a whippoorwill. I did a thorough check of the cabin and the immediate surroundings, but found nothing out of the ordinary. When I told Mason it was probably just a dream, he shook his head vigorously. "It wasn't a dream," he insisted. "Someone was crying. They needed help." I tried to dismiss his concerns, but something about the certainty in his voice made my skin crawl. Then the disappearances began. At first, they were easy to explain away. Kids are notorious for wandering off or losing track of time during activities. When Jeremy Matthews didn't show up for breakfast one morning, we assumed he'd overslept. When Sarah Collins missed archery practice, everyone figured she was probably reading in her favorite spot by the lake. But when 3 kids vanished within the span of 24 hours, leaving behind their belongings and no sign of where they'd gone, we couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Mr. Caldwell called an emergency meeting of all the counselors in the main lodge, his usually cheerful face grave as he organized us into search parties. I was paired with Rachel Sullivan, one of the senior counselors who had been working at Camp Brookside even longer than I had. Rachel was the kind of person who could silence a rowdy dining hall with a single raised eyebrow, all efficiency and no nonsense, with her blonde hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail and a whistle perpetually hanging around her neck. As we set out to search the area around the lake, the tension between us was palpable. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. "Do you think they just wandered off?" Rachel asked, breaking the heavy silence between us. Her voice carried a hint of doubt that matched my own growing unease. "Maybe," I replied, though we both knew better. Kids don't just vanish into thin air, not 3 at once, not without leaving some trace behind. Our search led us to the old boathouse, a decrepit structure that had been largely abandoned years ago when the camp built a newer facility closer to the main grounds. The weathered wooden boards creaked ominously under our feet as we approached, and the smell of rotting wood and stagnant water grew stronger with each step. I pushed open the door, wincing at the loud protest of rusted hinges. The interior was a jumble of shadows and shapes, old canoes stacked against the walls, fishing gear hanging from hooks, cobwebs stretching between rafters like ghostly curtains. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the musty space. A shuffling sound from the back of the building made both Rachel and I freeze in our tracks. We exchanged a quick glance before moving cautiously toward the noise, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Huddled in the corner, partially hidden behind an overturned rowboat, we found Jimmy Peterson, one of the missing kids. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, and his normally bright eyes were wide with terror. "Jimmy!" Rachel exclaimed, rushing forward to check on him. "Are you okay? What happened?" Jimmy's lower lip trembled as he looked up at us. "He took them," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Who took them?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "The man by the lake," Jimmy replied, his words sending a chill down my spine. "He said he had something cool to show us, but then he locked us in here." The implications of Jimmy's words hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been targeting our kids, luring them away with promises of adventure. And if Jimmy was here, there was a good chance the others were nearby as well. I told Rachel to stay with Jimmy while I checked the surrounding area. The moment I stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the summer evening. The woods around the boathouse had grown unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive silence that made every crunch of leaves under my feet sound like a gunshot. A rustling in the nearby bushes caught my attention, and I turned just in time to see him, a tall, gaunt figure with wild, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard that couldn't quite hide the cruel twist of his mouth. In his hand, something metallic caught the dying light, a knife with a long, wicked-looking blade. For a moment we just stared at each other, his dark eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. His response was a grin that seemed to split his face in half, revealing yellowed teeth as he took a menacing step in my direction. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran back to the boathouse, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "We need to go now," I shouted, bursting through the door. Rachel didn't ask questions. She just grabbed Jimmy's hand and followed me as we sprinted back toward the main camp. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, getting closer with each passing second. My lungs were burning, and Jimmy was struggling to keep up, but we couldn't slow down. We burst into the clearing where the main camp building stood, my voice cracking as I shouted for help. Other counselors and Mr. Caldwell came running, but when they arrived, our pursuer had vanished back into the woods like a nightmare fading in the morning light. The next few hours were a blur of activity. We organized another search party, larger this time, equipped with proper flashlights and walkie-talkies. I went back out with Rachel, joined by 2 other counselors, Tom Martinez and Lisa Chen. The knowledge that we were dealing with an actual person, someone who had deliberately targeted our kids, gave our search a new urgency. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger. Every unexpected sound made us jump. We found a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth leading deeper into the woods, away from the lake. Following it brought us to a small clearing, and there we found them, the missing children, tied to trees with rope, scared but alive. Their captor stood among them like a twisted shepherd with his flock, that same cruel smile playing across his face. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. I shouted for him to let the kids go, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. He turned to face us, and for a brief moment I thought he might actually surrender. Then he lunged at me, knife flashing in the beam of our flashlights. I managed to dodge his attack, and Tom took advantage of his momentum to tackle him to the ground. The knife went spinning away into the underbrush, where Rachel quickly retrieved it. While Tom and Rachel kept the man subdued, Lisa and I worked to free the children, our fingers fumbling with the knots as we tried to move as quickly as possible. By the time we made it back to camp, police cars were filling the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the trees in alternating colors. The man was taken into custody, and we learned later that he was a drifter with a history of similar incidents in other states. The children were reunited with their parents, who had been called as soon as the disappearances were discovered. There were tears and hugs, questions and statements, paperwork and interviews that seemed to go on forever. Later that night, after everything had finally calmed down, I found myself sitting by the lake again. The water was calm, reflecting the stars like a mirror, showing no sign of the terror that had unfolded on its shores. Rachel joined me, wordlessly handing me a bottle of water before settling onto the dock beside me. "How does something like this happen?" I asked, more to myself than to her. "How does someone just walk into a camp full of children and—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Rachel was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Some questions don't have good answers," she said finally. "But what matters is that we found them. They're safe now." The camp closed early that summer, sending the remaining campers home with partial refunds and profuse apologies. The incident made the local news, then the national news, sparking discussions about security at summer camps and the vulnerability of children in general. Mr. Caldwell spent the next year implementing new safety measures, security cameras, better lighting, stricter check-in procedures for visitors. But something fundamental had changed about Camp Brookside. The innocence that had made it special, that sense of freedom and adventure, had been tainted. I've never been able to forget that summer, particularly Mason and his strange warnings. Sometimes I wonder if he somehow sensed what was coming, if those piercing blue eyes of his saw something the rest of us couldn't. I think about Jimmy, about how brave he was in the face of unimaginable fear. I think about all the children who trusted us to keep them safe, and how close we came to failing them completely. It's been several years now, and I haven't returned to Camp Brookside. I hear it's still operating with better security and new management, but I can't bring myself to go back. The memories are too vivid, too raw. But I carry the lessons of that summer with me every day. the importance of trusting your instincts, of taking children seriously when they tell you something is wrong, of being vigilant even in places that seem safe and familiar. Life has a way of teaching us its most important lessons through our hardest experiences. That summer taught me about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic places. But it also showed me the strength of human resilience, the power of community, and the fierce protectiveness that can emerge when children are in danger. I went to Camp Brookside thinking I would be teaching kids about nature and crafts and campfire songs. Instead, I learned about courage, about trust, and about the thin line between safety and danger that we all walk every day. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that lake, about Mason standing at its edge, seeing something none of us could see. In my dreams, I listen to him more carefully, act more quickly, prevent the horror that followed. But then I wake up and remind myself that we did save them, in the end. And maybe that's the real story here, not the darkness that threatened to destroy something beautiful, but the light that helped us find our way back from it. My name is Michael Garcia, and I'm just a regular guy with a knack for fixing things. I run a small repair shop in East Alton, a quiet little town in Illinois where everybody knows everybody else, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is the annual Harvest Festival. My shop sits on the corner of Maple and 3rd, a worn brick building with a faded sign that reads, Garcia's Repairs, in chipped red paint. Most days you'll find me there, surrounded by the comforting smell of motor oil and metal, the rhythmic clanking of tools against machinery creating a familiar symphony that's been the soundtrack to my life for the past 15 years. I've always loved the simple life, tinkering with engines that need coaxing back to life, playing cards with friends at the Rusty Nail on Thursday nights, and spending peaceful weekends fishing on Lake Madison, where the bass bite best just as the sun starts to peek over the horizon. But this story isn't about my normal life. This story is about what happened one summer, a summer that changed everything. The day that set everything in motion was deceptively ordinary. It was early June, the kind of morning where the air feels fresh and full of possibility, when my buddy Jeff called me up. I was elbow deep in Mrs. Henderson's ancient washing machine at the time, trying to figure out why it was making a sound like a cat caught in a blender. Jeff's voice crackled through my cell phone speaker, carrying that familiar mix of warmth and mischief that I'd known since our high school days, when we were both too smart for our own good and not nearly as wise as we thought we were. He needed help at his family's summer camp, Camp Lakota, a place I'd heard countless stories about, but had never visited myself. The camp needed a handyman to fix up some things before the kids arrived, and Jeff thought of me. Maybe it was the nostalgia in his voice, or maybe it was the fact that I owed him for that time he helped me out of a jam with my ex-wife's lawyer, but I found myself agreeing before I'd really thought it through. I arrived at Camp Lakota on a Thursday morning in mid-June, driving my old Ford pickup down a winding dirt road that seemed to lead straight into the heart of nowhere. The camp appeared suddenly around a bend, like something out of an old postcard. Wooden cabins scattered among tall pines, their weather-worn sides telling stories of countless summers past. A mess hall stood in the center, its wide windows reflecting the morning sun, and beyond it, a small dock stretched out into a lake that looked like polished glass. The place had a rustic charm that spoke of simpler times, when kids spent their summers learning to tie knots and roast marshmallows instead of staring at screens. Jeff met me in the gravel parking lot, and the years seemed to melt away as he wrapped me in a bear hug that threatened to crack my ribs. He looked exactly as I remembered him, tall and broad-shouldered, with that permanent hint of sunburn on his nose, and the same wide grin that had talked us both into and out of trouble more times than I could count. "Lars, you old dog," he boomed, clapping me on the back hard enough to make me stumble. "Good to see you, buddy." The nickname was an old joke from our teenage years when I'd tried and failed spectacularly to grow a beard like a Viking. Somehow it had stuck. I returned his grin, feeling the familiar ease of our friendship settling over me like a comfortable old jacket. "Good to see you too, Jeff. So what's the plan?" He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his back pocket, unfolding it to reveal a list of repairs that looked longer than my monthly inventory sheet. Nothing too complicated, he assured me, though his eyes told a different story. Leaky faucets, broken windows, creaky doors. Just the usual wear and tear from winter. We've got a week before the kids show up, so no rush. The first few days passed in a pleasant blur of routine maintenance work. I found myself falling into an easy rhythm, moving from task to task under the canopy of towering pines. The air was different here, crisp and clean in a way that made my lungs feel like they were working properly for the first time in years. During the days, I'd work on my list of repairs, the simple physical labor feeling more like therapy than actual work. The sound of birds singing and wind rustling through the trees replaced the usual cacophony of car engines and air compressors that filled my days back home. At night, we'd gather around the campfire where Jeff's wife Carla would cook up meals that put any restaurant to shame. Their kids, Mike and Lisa, would regale us with stories about school and their plans for the summer, their faces flickering in the firelight. Mike, 15 and already showing signs of his father's height, had his mother's quiet thoughtfulness. Lisa, 2 years younger, was all energy and sharp wit, reminding me so much of Jeff at that age that it sometimes made me do a double take. Those evenings felt like something out of a movie. The crackling fire, the stars overhead, the smell of pine needles and wood smoke, and the comfortable feeling of being surrounded by family, even if it wasn't technically my own. But on the fourth day, everything changed. I was replacing a broken window pane in cabin 7, carefully removing the old putty while humming along to some classic rock playing from my portable radio, when Mike came running up. His sneakers kicked up dust as he skidded to a stop, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. His face was pale, despite the summer heat, and he was breathing hard, like he'd sprinted the whole way from wherever he'd been. "Uncle Lars," he gasped, using the honorary title he'd given me years ago. "You gotta come quick. There's something weird down by the old storage shed." I set down my tools, wiping my hands on my jeans as I studied his face. Mike wasn't the type to get spooked easily. I'd seen him handle spider infestations and power outages with the kind of calm that would make a Buddhist monk proud. Whatever had him rattled, it had to be serious. The storage shed sat at the edge of the camp property, half hidden by overgrown bushes and looking like it had been forgotten by time itself. The building was small, maybe 12 feet square, with weathered gray boards and a slightly sagging roof. As we approached, I immediately noticed something was off. The heavy padlock that should have been securing the door was lying broken on the ground, and the door itself stood wide open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Inside, chaos reigned. Tools that should have been hanging neatly on the walls were scattered across the floor like someone had thrown them in a fit of rage. Shelves had been knocked over, their contents spilled and broken. What caught my eye, though, wasn't the mess. It was the deliberateness of it all. This wasn't the random destruction of vandals looking for valuable things to steal. This felt personal, like someone was sending a message. "What the hell happened here?" I muttered, running my flashlight beam over the destruction. The beam caught something dark and sticky on one of the fallen shelves. For a moment my heart stopped, but it was just old motor oil, thank God. Mike shifted nervously beside me, his sneakers scuffing against the dusty floor. "I don't know. We never come down here. Dad says it's been locked since before I was born." We spent the next hour cleaning up the mess, though something told me we were disturbing evidence we should have left alone. Every crunch of broken glass under our boots made me wince. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the open door, expecting to see... what? I wasn't sure, but the forest beyond the shed seemed darker somehow, the spaces between the trees holding secrets I didn't want to uncover. That night, over Carla's famous beef stew, I mentioned the incident to Jeff. We were sitting at the old picnic table outside the mess hall, the evening air still warm enough to eat outdoors. The kids were down by the lake with Carla, their laughter carrying across the water. Jeff's face grew serious as I described the scene at the shed. "Maybe some animal got in," he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. He pushed his stew around with his spoon, something I'd never seen him do with Carla's cooking before. "Bears, maybe. We've had them before." He paused, then added quietly, "We should keep an eye out, though. just in case. The next day brought more unsettling discoveries. Carla came to find me while I was fixing a stubborn screen door on the mess hall. Her usually composed face was pinched with worry. "Lars, you got a minute?" She lowered her voice, glancing around like she didn't want to be overheard. "Some of our food supplies are missing. Not just snacks the kids might have taken, I mean serious amounts. Canned goods, flour, even the whole ham I was saving for Sunday dinner." We started locking everything up at night after that. Not just the kitchen and the tool shed, but all the cabins too. It felt wrong somehow, having to lock doors at a summer camp, like we were admitting that something had invaded this place of childhood innocence. But we did it anyway, and we all slept a little better for it. At least we did until 2 days later. I was working on a section of fence that marked the boundary between the camp and the deeper woods. The day was heating up, and I'd stripped down to my tank top, sweat running down my back as I dug post holes. That's when I heard the scream. Not the playful shrieks of kids having fun. This was pure terror, high and sharp and cutting through the summer air like a knife. It was Lisa. I dropped my shovel and ran, my boots pounding against the packed earth. I found her by the dock, her face chalk white, hands trembling as she pointed toward the tree line. "There's a man in the woods," she cried, her voice breaking. "I saw him watching me. He was just standing there, staring." Jeff and I grabbed flashlights and headed into the trees, though the summer sun was still high. The forest was dense here, old-growth pines creating deep shadows even in midday. We searched for nearly an hour, finding nothing but broken branches and what might have been footprints in the soft earth. When we returned, Lisa was sitting in the mess hall with Carla, a cup of hot chocolate in her shaking hands, even though it was easily 80 degrees outside. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old cabin's timber sounded like footsteps. Every whisper of wind became voices. Around midnight I heard it, real footsteps this time, crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up in my bunk, heart hammering. "Jeff!" I hissed across the darkness. "Wake up!" We armed ourselves with kitchen knives and an old baseball bat we found in the sports equipment shed. The moon was almost full, casting everything in silvery light that made shadows look solid, and solid things look like shadows. We moved carefully between the cabins, checking on the kids and Carla first. They were safe, doors still locked. The attack came from nowhere. One moment I was scanning the trees with my flashlight, the next I was on the ground, the breath knocked out of me. My flashlight went spinning, the beam creating crazy patterns in the darkness. I caught a glimpse of my attacker, tall, powerfully built, wearing dark clothes and something over his face. He moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Jeff shouted and swung the bat, but the figure was already moving, melting back into the darkness with unnatural speed. We heard branches breaking as he disappeared into the woods, then nothing but our own heavy breathing and pounding hearts. The next morning brought the police, Officers Thompson and Reed from the county sheriff's department. They were professional enough, but I could tell they weren't taking us as seriously as they should. To them, we were probably just city folks spooked by normal forest sounds. They promised to patrol the area, but advised us to keep in mind that wild animals can sometimes act strangely. That night changed everything. We were all sitting around the campfire, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the kids' sake, when we heard it, a massive crash from the direction of Cabin 3. This time we were ready. Jeff and I ran toward the sound, flashlight beams bouncing, while Carla got the kids into the mess hall and locked the door. The cabin door had been smashed inward with incredible force. Splinters of wood scattered across the floor. Inside, it looked like a tornado had hit. Beds were overturned, mattresses slashed. But what made my blood run cold was the message on the wall, written in what looked like red paint but smelled metallic and organic. "Leave now." We didn't wait for morning. Within an hour, we had the kids and essential supplies packed into the cars. The police arrived just as we were finishing, having been radioed by Officer Thompson, who was supposed to be patrolling the area. They took one look at the message on the wall and finally started taking things seriously. Too late, as far as we were concerned. As we were doing a final check of the grounds, something caught my eye, a glint of metal near the tree line. I walked over and found an old pocket watch, the kind you might see in an antique store. It was silver, with intricate engravings on the case and a long chain. Something about it seemed important, so I pocketed it without telling the others. The camp stayed closed that summer. Jeff and Carla eventually sold it to a developer who planned to turn it into luxury vacation homes, though I heard those plans fell through. The police investigation went nowhere. They found prints, sure, but nothing that matched their database. The red substance on the wall turned out to be paint mixed with animal blood, probably from local wildlife, they said. Life went back to normal, or something close to it. I returned to my shop fixing engines and appliances, playing cards at the Rusty Nail, fishing on weekends. But I never quite shook the feeling that something unfinished was out there, waiting. Then, about 6 months later, he walked into my shop. It was a Tuesday afternoon, cold and gray. He needed his truck's alternator replaced. Simple enough job. He was older, maybe 65 or 70, with a weathered face and eyes like black ice. What caught my attention was the pocket watch hanging from his vest, identical to the one I'd found at the camp. "Nice watch," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't see many like that anymore." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I knew. Those were the eyes I'd seen in the darkness that night, behind whatever mask he'd been wearing. "Found it in the woods," he said, his voice like gravel. "Lost its twin somewhere, though." "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was asking about. The watch? The camp? All of it? He just looked at me with those cold eyes and shrugged. "Places have power," he said finally. "Some places need to stay wild, need to stay pure." He paid for the alternator and left. I never saw him again. I still have that pocket watch locked away in my desk drawer. Sometimes late at night I take it out and look at it, remembering that summer at Camp Lakota. I think about Jeff and his family, about the man with the cold eyes, about places that need to stay wild. I think about how thin the line is between the world we know and the darker one that lies just beyond the trees. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing, leaving when we did. Other times I wonder if we should have left sooner. But mostly, I wonder about that man and if he's still out there protecting other wild places in his own twisted way. The camp's been abandoned now for years. I drove by there last summer. The buildings are still standing, but nature's taking it back slowly. Vines crawl up the cabin walls and saplings push through the old gravel paths. Maybe that's what he wanted all along. One thing's for sure, I'll never forget that summer at Camp Lakota, and the lesson I learned: sometimes the quietest places hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the woods. They're the ones trying to keep everyone else out. My name is Joseph Taylor. I'm sitting here in my study watching the sun set behind the mountains, trying to find the right words to tell this story. At 69 years old, I've seen my share of life's horrors: war, disease, the slow decay of time. But nothing compares to what happened that summer of 2002 at Camp Tall Pines. Some memories fade with time, but this one stays sharp as a knife's edge. I grew up in Clearfield, Pennsylvania, one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. My father worked the coal mines until black lung took him when I was 15. Mom did her best, working double shifts at the local diner to keep food on the table. Maybe that's why I spent so much time in the woods. It was free entertainment, and nature didn't care if your clothes came from Goodwill or whether you could afford the latest whatever. By my early 20s, I'd mapped every trail within 20 miles of town. The forest was my sanctuary, my escape from a life that seemed to be going nowhere fast. I dropped out of Penn State after 2 years, my attempt at a business degree derailed by a combination of lack of interest and empty pockets. Instead, I bounced between jobs: construction, retail, whatever would pay the bills. The one constant in my life was hiking. Every weekend, rain or shine, I'd be out there with my beaten-up backpack and the compass my dad gave me before he died. I knew every stream, every deer trail, every hidden valley. The locals started calling me Woods Walker, and I wore the nickname with pride. That's how I met Garrett Stevens. He was doing trail maintenance for the State Park Service, and we kept running into each other on the more remote paths. Garrett was different from the other rangers. He had this intensity about him, especially when talking about the deeper parts of the forest. He'd grown up in Maine, surrounded by endless woods, and he carried that wildness in his eyes. "The trees have secrets," he'd say, half joking but not really. Things city folks wouldn't understand. We became fast friends, bonding over campfire coffee and shared tales of close calls in the backcountry. Through Garrett, I met Jace Martinez and Milo Chen. Jace was a former Army Ranger turned wilderness guide, with the kind of quiet competence that made you feel safe just being around him. Milo was a biology graduate student, studying the impact of climate change on local ecosystems. Together, we formed an unlikely but tight-knit group. When Garrett mentioned the summer job at Camp Tall Pines, it seemed perfect. The pay wasn't great, $2,000 for the summer, plus room and board, but it was a chance to spend 3 months in the Adirondacks, doing what we loved. The camp needed experienced outdoorsmen to lead wilderness activities, and between the 4 of us, we had every qualification they could want. "It'll be like getting paid to vacation," Garrett said, showing us the brochure. The photos showed a pristine lake surrounded by towering pines, rustic cabins with stone fireplaces, happy kids learning archery and canoeing. What the brochure couldn't show, was what waited for us in those woods. Camp Tall Pines looked exactly like the brochure at first glance. The main lodge was a massive log structure overlooking Lake Silence, a name that would later seem prophetic. A dozen cabins spread out along the shoreline, connected by gravel paths lined with solar-powered lights. The camp could house up to 120 kids plus staff, though we rarely had more than 80 at a time. Our cabin was at the far end of the camp, closest to the wilderness area. It was bigger than the others, with 4 separate rooms and a common area with a stone fireplace. The previous occupants had carved their names into the ceiling beams, decades of staff members leaving their mark. I remember running my fingers over those names that first night, wondering what stories they could tell. The first few weeks were idyllic. We settled into an easy routine: breakfast at 7, morning activities until lunch, free time in the afternoon, then evening programs around the campfire. I taught wilderness survival, showing kids how to build shelters and start fires without matches. Garrett handled water activities, Jace ran the climbing wall, and Milo led nature walks. Looking back, there were signs from the beginning. Little things that seemed odd but not quite wrong enough to raise alarm. The lake was unusually deep for its size, over 200 feet in places according to the old surveys. Fish were scarce despite the perfect habitat, and birds, there were always fewer birds than there should have been. The first real incident happened during week 3. I was leading a group of 12-year-olds on an overnight camping trip, teaching them how to read trailblazes and use a compass. We were about 2 miles from camp when one of the kids, Tommy, started acting strange. He kept stopping, staring into the woods with this vacant expression. "Mr. Taylor," he said finally, his voice trembling, "someone's calling my name." I listened but heard nothing except wind in the trees. The other kids were getting spooked, so I decided to head back early. As we walked, Tommy got more agitated. He swore he could hear someone whispering, getting closer and closer. By the time we reached camp, he was in tears. We wrote it off as an overactive imagination, but similar incidents started happening more frequently. Kids would wake up screaming about faces at their windows. Others refused to go near the lake, saying they saw hands reaching up from the water. The camp director, Bill Henderson, blamed it on ghost stories getting out of hand. Then came the night of the raft incident. It was late July, one of those nights when the heat hangs heavy even after sunset. We'd finished evening activities early because of an approaching storm. The kids were all in their cabins, and the 4 of us decided to blow off some steam with a few beers. Garrett had smuggled in a 12-pack of local craft beer, and we sat around the fireplace trading stories and jokes. Around midnight, he got that look in his eye, the one that always meant trouble was coming. "Let's swim out to the raft," he said, grinning, "like the old days." The raft in question was anchored about 50 yards offshore. It was an old wooden platform, probably 15 feet square, that had been there since the camp opened in the 1960s. During the day, it was a popular spot for kids to swim to and dive from. At night, it was strictly off-limits. I should have said no. Something about the lake had been bothering me all summer. The the way the water seemed to swallow light, how the surface would sometimes ripple against the wind. But peer pressure and beer are a potent combination. The water was surprisingly cold for July. As we swam out, I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. No frogs, no insects, not even the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. Just the sound of our breathing and the gentle splash of our strokes. We reached the raft and pulled ourselves up. The old wood creaked under our weight, and I could feel it shifting slightly with the waves. We lay there catching our breath, looking up at the stars peeking through gathering clouds. That's when I heard it, a sound like someone running their fingers along the underside of the raft. Slow, deliberate scraping that made the whole platform vibrate. Before I could say anything, Milo sat up suddenly. "Did you guys feel that?" Another scrape, louder this time, followed by a distinct tapping pattern. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 slow ones, like a signal. "Probably just fish," Garrett said, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. The tapping stopped, replaced by something worse, a low humming sound coming from deep underwater. It was barely audible at first, but it grew steadily louder and higher in pitch, until it made our teeth vibrate. Then we saw the hands. They emerged from the water slowly, gripping the edge of the raft. Long, pale fingers with too many joints, skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. One pair, then another and another, until the raft was surrounded. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. Someone screamed. I think it was Jace. The raft tilted sharply as something massive pushed up from below. We all scrambled to our feet, but the wooden surface was slick with algae and spray. I saw Milo go over first, pulled by one of those horrible hands. Garrett dove in after him while Jace and I stood frozen in terror. The water churned with activity, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of something beneath the surface. A pale, elongated face with eyes like black marbles, a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Then the storm hit. Lightning split the sky, thunder crashing so close it felt like the world was ending. In that bright flash, I saw dozens of them in the water, twisted, humanoid shapes moving with impossible grace beneath the surface. We made it back to shore somehow, all 4 of us alive but changed forever. Milo had deep scratches down his leg where something had grabbed him. Garrett was bleeding from cuts on his arms and chest. Jace couldn't stop shaking. We spent the rest of the night in our cabin, doors locked, lights on, taking turns watching the lake through the windows. The storm raged until dawn, but beneath the thunder we could hear them, splashing, moving in the water, occasionally making sounds that were almost like singing. The next morning the lake was calm as glass. If it wasn't for our injuries and the deep gouges we found in the raft's underside, we might have convinced ourselves it was all a beer-fueled nightmare. We tried to tell Bill Henderson what had happened, but he dismissed our story, said we were irresponsible for drinking and swimming at night, threatened to fire us if we mentioned it to anyone else. But things got worse after that night. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed to know we had seen them. They grew bolder, more aggressive. Kids started disappearing from their cabins at night, only to be found wandering the woods at dawn with no memory of how they got there. Strange marks appeared on the dock posts, complex symbols carved into the wood that seemed to change when you weren't looking directly at them. The breaking point came a week later. During an afternoon swim session, something grabbed one of the younger campers and tried to drag him under. Jace managed to save him, but not before whatever it was left deep puncture wounds in the boy's leg wounds that the camp nurse said looked like they came from human teeth. That night we broke into Henderson's office. We had to know if he knew more than he was telling us. In a locked filing cabinet we found old newspaper clippings dating back to the 1940s. Stories about mysterious disappearances around the lake, reports of strange lights and sounds, and most disturbing of all, a series of photographs showing what looked like humanoid figures emerging from the water. The latest article was from 1972, describing how 3 camp counselors vanished during a late-night swim. The camp had closed for several years after that incident, only reopening under new management in the 1980s. We were planning our next move when we heard it, that familiar scraping sound, but this time it was coming from inside the building. Something was moving through the pipes. The official investigation concluded that we had encountered a group of violent transients living in the woods. The scratches, the bite marks, the missing campers, all explained away with rational, mundane causes. The camp closed permanently that summer, cited for multiple safety violations. Garrett moved to Arizona, as far from large bodies of water as he could get. Milo finished his degree but switched his focus to desert ecosystems. Jace took his own life 2 years later, leaving behind a journal full of drawings of what he'd seen in the lake. I still hike, still love the woods. But I never swim in lakes anymore. Sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear that humming sound, feel those cold fingers reaching for me through the darkness, and I wonder about what really lives in the deep places of the world, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. Last year I received a package with no return address. Inside was a water-damaged photograph showing the lake at Camp Tall Pines. At first glance, it looked normal, but when I held it up to the light, I could see them. Dozens of pale faces just beneath the surface, all turned toward the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, "They're spreading." I keep the photo locked away now, but sometimes I take it out just to remind myself that it was real. That somewhere out there in the dark waters of Lake Silence, something is still waiting, still watching, still hungry. And sometimes on very quiet nights I swear I can hear that tapping, 3 quick, 2 slow, coming from the pipes in my walls. My name is John Anderson, and I write this now from the relative safety of my apartment in Boston, though safety feels like an illusion these days. What happened in the summer of 1995 fundamentally changed how I see the world, particularly the parts of it we think we understand. I was 24 then, fresh out of college with a degree in psychology and a mountain of student debt. The job market was tight, and when I saw the posting for a counselor position at Camp Pine Ridge in upstate New York, it seemed like the perfect escape from the suffocating pressure of post-graduation life. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors, despite, or maybe because of, growing up in the concrete canyons of Philadelphia. My father, before the cancer took him during my junior year, had instilled in me a deep respect for nature. Every summer until I was 16, he'd take me camping in the Poconos, teaching me about tracking, plant identification, and the importance of listening to what he called the voice of the wild. Those trips were more than just father-son bonding. They were an education in survival and self-reliance that would later save my life. Camp Pine Ridge sat on the edge of the Adirondack Mountains, far enough from civilization to feel remote but close enough to be accessible. The facility was classic summer camp, rustic cabins arranged in a horseshoe around a central lodge, a sprawling mess hall that doubled as a rainy day activity center, and a large lake that stretched like a mirror into the distance. The surrounding forest was old growth, thick with towering pines and ancient oaks that had stood sentinel long before the first European settlers arrived. I arrived 2 weeks before the campers, part of the staff orientation period. That's where I met Vince Martinez, who would become both my co-counselor and my link to sanity in the weeks that followed. Vince was 28, a former Marine who'd done 2 tours in Desert Storm before finding his way to Pine Ridge. He had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from seeing the worst the world has to offer, and choosing to find good in it anyway. "First time working with kids?" he asked on our second night, as we sat by the staff fire pit sharing a beer. The orientation days were long but relatively relaxed, filled with first aid training, emergency protocols, and team-building exercises. "Yeah," I admitted, "but I've always been good with them. My sister has 3, and I basically helped raise them while she worked double shifts at the hospital." Vince nodded approvingly. "That'll help. Kids can smell fear or uncertainty. You've got to be their rock, especially out here where homesickness hits hard." He took a long pull from his beer before adding, "Plus, you've got outdoor experience. That puts you ahead of half the staff already." I liked Vince immediately. He had an easy way about him, but there was also a watchfulness that I recognized from my father, the mark of someone who understood that nature demanded respect. Over those early days, we fell into an easy rhythm, sharing stories and learning the ins and outs of camp life from the returning staff members. The other counselors were a mixed bunch, Most were college students or recent graduates like me, looking for a summer job that offered something different from retail or office work. A few were teachers taking advantage of their summer break. Then there was Mrs. Catherine Jenkins, the camp director, a stern woman in her 50s who'd been running Pine Ridge for over 2 decades. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd seen it all and wasn't easily impressed. "Remember," she told us during one of our training sessions, "you're not just responsible for these children's entertainment. You're responsible for their lives. The woods may be beautiful, but they can also be dangerous. Never let your guard down." At the time I thought she was just being dramatic, trying to impress upon us the seriousness of our responsibility. Later I would understand she was trying to warn us about something specific, something she'd seen or experienced but couldn't bring herself to fully explain. The camp itself was impressive in its scope. Beyond the main facilities there were miles of hiking trails ranging from easy nature walks to challenging backcountry paths. The lake offered swimming, canoeing, and fishing, with a sandy beach area for the younger kids and a deep water dock for the older ones. The surrounding forest was dense and largely unexplored, part of a vast tract of protected wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. During those orientation days, I spent my free time exploring the trails, mapping them in my mind and noting potential spots for nature activities. The forest felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before, not just with wildlife, but with something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The trees seemed older here, their branches reaching across the trails to create natural tunnels that blocked out most of the sunlight. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and mountain laurel, creating perfect hiding spots for small animals, or anything else that might want to remain unseen. One afternoon, while hiking one of the more remote trails, I came across something odd, a perfect circle of dead vegetation, maybe 15 feet in diameter. The grass and plants within the circle weren't just dead. They were blackened, as if burned, though there were no scorch marks or other signs of fire. I mentioned it to Vince that evening. "Probably just some kind of fungus," he said. But I noticed him exchange a look with Mrs. Jenkins, who happened to be passing by. The woods can do strange things. The first batch of campers arrived on a Sunday, 60 kids ranging in age from 8 to 14, divided into cabins by age and gender. Vince and I were assigned to cabin 12, which housed 10 boys aged 11, 13. They were a good group, full of energy and enthusiasm, though one kid stood out. Michael Rivera, a quiet 12-year-old who seemed more interested in the forest than in making friends. That first week was exactly what you'd expect from summer camp: swimming lessons, nature hikes, craft projects, and campfire songs. The days fell into a comfortable routine, and I found myself enjoying the work more than I'd expected. The kids were generally well behaved, and the few homesickness cases were easily handled with extra attention and activities. But there were moments, brief flashes, when something felt off. Times when the forest would go completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Nights when the darkness between the trees seemed deeper than it should be, moving in ways the darkness shouldn't move. And always there was that sense of being watched, of eyes following our every move from just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination, combined with the natural eeriness of being in the wilderness. I'd grown up on campfire stories about monsters in the woods, and part of me was still that scared kid jumping at shadows. Besides, I had responsibilities, kids to look after, activities to run, safety protocols to follow. If only I'd listened to those early warnings, paid attention to the signs that something wasn't right. Maybe then I could have prevented what happened next. Maybe then some of us would have made it out unscathed. But that's not how this story goes. The trouble started during the 3rd week of camp, though looking back, the signs had been there all along. We just hadn't wanted to see them. It began with small things: equipment going missing from the storage shed, strange tracks in the mud that didn't match any local wildlife, and that persistent feeling of being watched that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Michael Rivera, our quiet observer, was the first to notice something truly unusual. He came to me one morning before breakfast, his usual reserve replaced by barely contained excitement. "Mr. Anderson," he said, clutching his notebook. He was never without it. "I need to show you something. He opened the notebook to reveal a series of detailed sketches. They showed what appeared to be tracks, but not like any I'd seen before. The prints were large, maybe 15 inches long, with odd angular patterns that didn't resemble either animal or human footprints. I found them by the lake, Michael explained, just past the restricted area. They went into the water and they came out different. Different how? Bigger. And there were more of them, like whatever made them was multiplying. I should have taken it more seriously. Should have remembered Mrs. Jenkins's warnings about staying vigilant. Instead, I patted Michael on the shoulder and suggested he'd found some interesting animal tracks, maybe from several different creatures crossing paths. That night I showed the drawings to Vince. His reaction surprised me. "Keep this quiet," he said, his voice low despite us being alone in the counselor's cabin. "We don't want to start a panic." "A panic about what? They're just tracks." Vince was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkening forest. "You ever wonder why there's a restricted area by the lake? Why Mrs. Jenkins is so strict about kids staying on the marked trails? Standard safety procedures, right? That's what they tell us to say." He turned to face me, his expression deadly serious. "But there's more to it. This camp, there's history here. Bad history." He told me then about the summer of '82, before either of us had come to Pine Ridge. 3 kids had gone missing from their cabins in the middle of the night. The official report said they'd wandered into the woods and gotten lost, but their bodies were never found. The strange part? The only traces left behind were tracks that, according to Vince, looked exactly like the ones in Michael's drawings. I wanted to dismiss it as just another camp ghost story, the kind every summer camp accumulates over the years. But something in Vince's voice, the way his hands shook slightly as he handed back Michael's notebook, made me think there was more to it. The next day I paid closer attention to the woods around us. The trees seemed different somehow, their branches reaching lower, creating deeper shadows even in broad daylight. The bird songs that usually filled the air were intermittent, with long periods of unnatural silence in between. And the lake was the strangest of all. By mid-June the days had grown longer, but somehow the shadows seemed to deepen. I started noticing things during our hikes, trails that appeared different on the return journey, trees that seemed to shift position when you weren't looking directly at them. The kids felt it too, though they couldn't articulate what was wrong. They clustered closer together during outdoor activities, and none of them wandered off alone anymore, except for Michael. I found him one afternoon standing at the edge of the restricted area, staring intently at something through the trees. His notebook was open, pencil moving rapidly across the page. "They're getting closer," he said without turning around. "Every day they move a little closer to camp." "Who's getting closer, Michael?" He showed me his notebook. The page was filled with dark, frenzied sketches, twisted shapes that hurt my eyes to look at, forms that seemed to shift and change even on the static paper. In the margins, he'd written the same phrase over and over: "The woods have teeth." I should have reported it immediately to Mrs. Jenkins, should have had Michael talk to the camp counselor. Instead, I made the mistake of trying to investigate myself. That night, after lights out, I took my flashlight and headed to the restricted area. The moon was full, but its light seemed somehow wrong, casting shadows that moved against the wind. The lake was unusually still, its surface like black glass reflecting the distorted stars. The temperature dropped as I approached the area Michael had been watching. My breath came out in visible puffs despite it being June. The beam of my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness between the trees, illuminating far less than it should have. That's when I found the first body. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The carcass had been turned inside out with surgical precision, its organs arranged in a perfect spiral around it. The blood was fresh, still glistening in my flashlight beam, but there were no flies, no scavengers, as if even the insects knew to stay away. The sound came then, a low metallic scraping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like steel dragging across stone, but somehow organic, alive. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness broken only by the sickly moonlight. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to move. The scraping grew louder, closer. Through the trees ahead, something moved, something big. It emerged into a patch of moonlight, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body a nightmare collection of angles that shouldn't exist. The skin, if you could call it that, shifted like oil on water, never settling on one color or texture. But it was the faces that broke me, dozens of them, human and animal, rippling across its surface like reflections in disturbed water. I recognized some of those faces. They were from the missing persons posters in town, the ones I'd seen but hadn't really paid attention to. Years of disappearances, all leading to this moment. The thing moved. It didn't walk or run. It folded, like paper being creased by invisible hands, covering the distance between us in an instant. The smell hit me first like burning plastic and decay. My flashlight was dead, but I could still see it. It generated its own light, a sickly phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with what I guessed was a heartbeat. I ran. I don't remember deciding to move. My body acted on pure instinct, turning and sprinting back toward camp. Behind me, that terrible scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by a high-pitched keening that made my teeth vibrate. The trees seemed to reach for me as I ran, branches snagging my clothes and whipping my face. The path back to camp twisted and turned in ways it never had before, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me lost. The thing pursued me, its movement making sounds that no living creature should make. I burst into the camp clearing just as Vince emerged from our cabin, probably alerted by my panicked flight through the woods. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Get the kids," I gasped out. "We need to evacuate, now." That's when the screaming started. The next few hours were chaos. We got most of the kids out, loaded onto the camp buses, and driven to safety. But we lost some. God help me, we lost some. The thing had been busy while I was out there, and it wasn't alone. There were others, different shapes, but all wrong in the same fundamental way, all bearing those horrible faces of the taken. Michael was among the missing. We found his notebook, its pages now filled with increasingly detailed drawings of the creatures, as if he'd been watching them, studying them. The final page held a single sentence. They were here first. The official investigation that followed was a joke. The authorities tried to blame it on bears, on escaped convicts, on anything that fit their understanding of the world. They found some bodies eventually, but not all of them. And the ones they did find, well, the reports were sealed for a reason. Mrs. Jenkins disappeared a week after the evacuation. They found her car at the camp entrance, engine still running, a notebook on the passenger seat filled with decades of observations. She'd known all along what was out there, had been documenting it, trying to understand it. The final entry read simply, "They're evolving." The days following the evacuation exist in my memory as a series of fragmented images, like a broken mirror reflecting pieces of a nightmare. The authorities descended on Camp Pine Ridge with a force that seemed excessive for what they were officially calling a wildlife incident, though their actions betrayed their words. Men in hazmat suits combed the woods, taking samples and measurements, while others set up a perimeter of floodlights that burned through the night. They questioned each of us repeatedly, their inquiries becoming increasingly specific about the shapes we'd seen, the sounds we'd heard, the way light seemed to bend wrong in certain areas of the forest. I watched them catalog evidence that would never appear in any official report. Strange marks on trees that seemed to shift position when photographed, soil samples that displayed impossible properties, and most disturbing of all, fragments of what looked like skin, but behaved like liquid mercury, constantly shifting and changing until they were sealed in specially designed containers and whisked away to unmarked vehicles. The parents of the missing children haunted the edges of the investigation, their faces drawn with a hope that diminished with each passing day. I couldn't look them in the eyes, couldn't bear to see the desperate belief that their children might still be found alive. How could I tell them what I'd seen? How could I explain that the faces I'd witnessed rippling across that creature's surface had looked peaceful, almost ecstatic, as if the horror of their absorption had given way to some terrible transcendence? The guilt ate at me, growing like a cancer in my gut. During the rare moments I managed to sleep, I dreamed of Michael's face, not as it had appeared on that thing, but as he had looked that last afternoon, standing at the edge of the restricted area with his notebook full of prophetic drawings, trying to warn us about what was coming. Vince and I were among the last to leave the area, staying to help with the search efforts even after most of the other staff had been sent home. We spent our days combing the woods with search parties and our nights huddled in a hotel room in town, sharing a bottle of whiskey and trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The forest had changed after that night, becoming almost normal again, as if whatever had dwelt there had retreated to some deeper, darker place. But there were signs for those who knew where to look. Patches of ground where nothing would grow, strange geometric patterns carved into tree trunks that seemed to follow mathematical principles that shouldn't exist in nature, and most tellingly, the complete absence of any animal life larger than an insect within a mile radius of where we'd encountered the creatures. The official story, when it finally emerged, was a masterpiece of mundane explanation. A combination of bear attacks and mass hysteria, they said. The missing children had wandered into restricted areas and fallen victim to natural hazards. The strange lights and sounds were attributed to illegal hunting activities, and the distorted bodies were explained away as the result of normal decomposition processes. A neat, tidy explanation that ignored the impossible angles we'd witnessed, the faces in the darkness, the way reality itself had seemed to bend and twist in the presence of those things. The camp was permanently closed, the land declared a protected wildlife sanctuary and fenced off from public access. Armed guards were posted at all entry points, officially to protect endangered species, but their weapons seemed excessive for preventing the occasional trespassing hiker. The years that followed changed all of us who survived that night. Vince left the country, taking a job teaching English in South Korea, about as far from any significant forests as he could get. He emails occasionally, always with the same underlying message. He's found peace in the concrete jungle, among millions of people and artificial lights that burn away the darkness. The other counselors scattered too, most leaving the camping industry entirely. Those few who stayed in related fields chose desert locations or coastal areas, places where the trees are sparse and the visibility is clear for miles. We keep in touch through a private online forum, sharing our ongoing experiences and the strange patterns we've noticed in news reports from around the world. Clusters of disappearances in national parks, unexplained phenomena in ancient forests, and most disturbing of all, the increasing frequency of incidents similar to what we witnessed at Pine Ridge. Mrs. Jenkins's notebook, which I managed to copy parts of before it was confiscated, revealed a history far darker and more extensive than any of us had imagined. The incidents at Pine Ridge hadn't been isolated events, but part of a pattern stretching back centuries. She had collected accounts from Native American tribes who had considered the area sacred and forbidden, tales from early settlers who had vanished while clearing the land, and more recent documentation of strange occurrences that seemed to follow a cyclical pattern. Her notes suggested that whatever dwelled in those woods was not simply predatory, but intelligent, purposeful, and worst of all, patient. The creatures, if that's what they were, appeared to be studying us as much as we were studying them, learning our patterns, our weaknesses, and most terrifyingly, our technology. The final pages of her notebook contained detailed observations of how the entities had evolved over the decades she had been watching them. Early encounters described them as almost purely physical beings, leaving behind physical evidence of their attacks. But more recent incidents showed them becoming more ethereal, able to manipulate light and shadow, to bend space in ways that defied our understanding of physics. The faces were a new development, something that had only begun appearing in the last few years before our encounter. Mrs. Jenkins' last entry suggested a terrifying possibility. They were not simply killing and displaying their victims, but absorbing them, incorporating their consciousness into some larger collective entity that was growing stronger and more sophisticated with each new addition. What I've come to understand in the years since Camp Pine Ridge is that knowledge is both a blessing and a curse. Once you've seen behind the veil of reality, you can never go back to comfortable ignorance. The world becomes a different place, filled with shadows that shouldn't exist and angles that don't quite align with Euclidean geometry. I see it everywhere now, little signs that most people miss or choose to ignore. the way certain trees in city parks seem to face the wrong direction when you look at them too long, the geometric patterns that appear in frost on windows during particularly cold nights, and most disturbing of all, the increasing frequency of disappearances in areas that share certain geographical and geological characteristics with Pine Ridge. I've spent countless hours researching these patterns, mapping incidents across the globe, and what I've found suggests something far more terrifying than isolated supernatural events. There's a pattern, a purpose, and an acceleration that keeps me awake at night. Through careful investigation and connections with others who have experienced similar phenomena, I've discovered that what we encountered at Pine Ridge was just one manifestation of something far older and more widespread than we could have imagined. The Native American tribes who once inhabited the area had names for them in their languages, names that translated roughly to those who walk between, the hungry shadows, or most tellingly, the ones who wear the faces of the taken. Similar descriptions appear in folklore from around the world, from the dark forests of Eastern Europe to the ancient woodlands of Japan. The details vary, but certain elements remain consistent: the geometric patterns, the distortion of natural laws, and most significantly, the gradual evolution of their hunting methods. What were once simple disappearances have become increasingly complex and sophisticated operations, suggesting an intelligence that learns and adapts with each encounter. The most disturbing development came 3 years ago when I received a package from Vince, the first direct communication I'd had with him in nearly a decade. Inside was a USB drive containing security camera footage from a hiking trail in South Korea, along with a handwritten note that simply said, "They're spreading." The footage showed something that made my blood run cold: a group of hikers encountering what appeared to be a normal park ranger, except that when viewed from certain angles, the ranger's form seemed to ripple and distort in a way that was horrifyingly familiar. The video ended abruptly, and subsequent investigation revealed that the entire hiking group had vanished without trace. The authorities blamed it on a landslide, but the pattern was unmistakable. They had learned to mimic us, to use our own forms and structures against us. Mrs. Jenkins's research, what little I managed to preserve before it was confiscated, suggested that these entities exist in a dimension adjacent to our own, pressing against the membrane of reality, like fingers testing the surface of a soap bubble. The places where they break through share common characteristics: old growth forests, unusual geological formations, and what she termed thin spots in the fabric of space-time. But what's truly terrifying is her final hypothesis, documented in a series of encrypted files that took me years to decode. They're not simply hunting us for food or sport, they're preparing for something. Each absorption, each taken face added to their collective, increases their understanding of our world and their ability to interact with it. The faces we saw weren't trophies. They were windows, learning tools, ways of understanding how to exist in our reality. The present situation is far more dire than any of us initially realized. Through careful monitoring and collaboration with a network of others who have encountered these entities, we've identified what appears to be a pattern of expansion. The incidents are no longer confined to remote wilderness areas. There have been sightings in city parks, urban forests, and even heavily populated areas where sufficient vegetation exists to create the right conditions. The creatures have evolved beyond their original forms, learning to compress and disguise themselves in increasingly sophisticated ways. They can now navigate human spaces with disturbing ease, mimicking our behaviors and social structures with an accuracy that makes them almost impossible to detect until it's too late. Last month, I received an email from one of the former Pine Ridge counselors, who now works as a park ranger in California. She described finding geometric patterns carved into the trunks of several ancient redwoods, patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed through a camera lens. More disturbing were the photographs she attached, images of what appeared to be normal hikers on the trails, except that their shadows fell in impossible directions, and when the photos were enhanced, their faces showed the same rippling, fluid quality we had witnessed years ago at Pine Ridge. The implications are staggering. They're not just mimicking individual humans anymore. They're creating entire groups, learning to move through our society in ways that allow them to operate almost completely undetected. The truth about what's happening has become increasingly difficult to ignore, though most people still manage to look away from the signs that surround them. In the past year alone, there have been over 300 documented cases of what the authorities term unusual disappearances, people vanishing from parks, forests, and even urban green spaces, leaving behind only geometric patterns and unexplainable electromagnetic disturbances. The official explanations have become more elaborate, stretching credibility to its breaking point as they try to maintain the illusion of a rational, understandable world. But those of us who know what to look for can see the pattern emerging, like a vast and terrible web being woven across the globe. The entities we encountered at Pine Ridge weren't isolated anomalies. They were scouts, the first wave of something far larger and more organized than we could have imagined. Through careful analysis of Mrs. Jenkins's remaining notes and collaboration with others who have encountered these beings, we've begun to understand their true nature. They're not simply predators or interdimensional travelers, but rather parts of a vast, collective intelligence that sees our reality as something to be colonized and absorbed. The most disturbing development came 6 months ago, when I received a series of photographs from a former Pine Ridge camper who had survived that terrible summer. Now an adult working in urban planning, she had noticed something strange in satellite imagery of major cities, patterns of park layouts and green spaces that, when viewed from above, formed the same geometric configurations we had found carved into trees at Pine Ridge. These patterns weren't random or coincidental. They had been deliberately designed and implemented over decades, suggesting a level of infiltration and influence that defies comprehension. The entities haven't just been hunting us, they've been reshaping our environment, creating networks of connected spaces that serve as conduits for their expansion. The urban forests and parks we've built, thinking we were preserving nature within our cities, may have inadvertently created a vast network of entry points for something that sees our entire civilization as nothing more than raw material to be processed and absorbed. What we're facing now is no longer a localized threat, but a systematic invasion, occurring so gradually and subtly that most people won't recognize it until it's too late. The beings have evolved far beyond their original forms. They no longer need to hide in deep forests or remote locations. They've learned to exist in the spaces between our everyday reality, in the shadows of skyscrapers and the quiet corners of public parks. Their mimicry has become nearly perfect. They can maintain human form for extended periods, integrated into our society in ways that make them almost impossible to detect. The only telltale signs are subtle, shadows that move slightly out of sync, reflections that don't quite match their sources, and most chillingly, an inability to appear in digital photographs without creating strange distortions in the image. They've adapted to our technology, learned to manipulate electronic devices and surveillance systems to hide their presence, making documentation of their activities increasingly difficult. Last week I received a frantic call from Vince, the first time we'd spoken directly in years. He had noticed something in his neighborhood in Seoul, a pattern of disappearances centered around a newly constructed urban garden project. The design of the garden incorporated the same geometric patterns we'd seen at Pine Ridge, and security camera footage showed people entering the space but never leaving, at least not in any form that remained purely human. What terrified him most wasn't just the disappearances, but the way other people seemed to simply accept them, their minds skating away from any evidence that contradicted their understanding of reality. It's as if humanity has developed a collective blind spot, a psychological defense mechanism that prevents most people from recognizing the horror that's gradually consuming our world. As I write these final pages, I'm acutely aware that this document may serve as both warning and confession. The network of survivors and investigators I've been working with has been growing smaller, either through disappearance or deliberate withdrawal from our shared investigation. Those who remain have noticed an acceleration in the pattern, more sightings, more disappearances, and most troublingly, more evidence of these entities achieving positions of influence within human society. We've identified several prominent urban planners, environmental scientists, and government officials whose photographs show the telltale signs of replacement, that subtle rippling effect in their features, the way their images seem to shift and change when viewed through different media. The implications are staggering. They're not just infiltrating our world, they're actively reshaping it to facilitate their expansion. The most haunting revelation came 3 days ago, when I received a package containing Michael's original notebook, apparently recovered from the restricted area at Pine Ridge. The pages were weathered but intact, and the final entries revealed something we had never considered. What we interpreted as an invasion might actually be a reclamation. Michael's drawings and notes suggested that these entities didn't come from another dimension or distant part of space. They were here first, existing in the deep forests and hidden places long before humans emerged to claim the surface world. Our civilization, our entire understanding of reality, might be nothing more than a temporary intrusion into their domain, and now they're simply taking back what was always theirs. I don't expect many will believe this account, and perhaps that's for the best. The human mind isn't equipped to handle the kind of fundamental shift in reality that comes with knowing what's really happening around us. I've chosen to make this record public not in the hope of stopping what's coming. I fear it's far too late for that, but as a testament to what we discovered and what it means for humanity's future. The process we witnessed at Pine Ridge is happening everywhere now, so gradually that most people will never notice until the transformation is complete. The world we knew is being hollowed out from within, replaced by something that operates on principles we can barely comprehend. For those who read this and recognize the signs I've described, my advice is simple. Stay away from forests, especially old growth. Avoid parks and green spaces after dark. Never trust photographs or videos completely. The entities have learned to manipulate digital media in ways that make documentation unreliable. And most importantly, if you encounter someone you know whose behavior seems slightly off, whose features seem to shift when viewed from certain angles, do not confront them. Do not let them know you can see what they really are. The time for resistance, if there ever was one, has long passed. As for me, I've made my peace with what's coming. The faces I saw that night at Pine Ridge, the ones that rippled across the surface of that impossible being, didn't show fear or pain. They showed transcendence. Perhaps what we're witnessing isn't an ending but a transformation, a forced evolution into something beyond our current understanding of consciousness. Or perhaps that's just what I need to believe to stay sane in a world that's becoming less human with each passing day. The woods have teeth, and they are hungry for more than just flesh. They hunger for our reality itself, and piece by piece, shadow by shadow, they are taking it. The process is inevitable now, as natural as the turning of seasons or the pull of tides. All we can do is watch and wait and wonder if what we become will remember what we once were. I never wanted to be the person who had a horror story to tell. Back in 2002, I was just Edward Thomas, a 20-year-old history major more interested in ancient battles than modern-day adventures. My world revolved around dusty library books and heated debates about the Civil War's turning points. The closest I usually got to danger was paper cuts from turning pages too quickly. My decision to become a counselor at Camp Firewood wasn't born from any great love of the outdoors. The truth was more mundane. I needed money, and the pay was decent for a summer job. Plus, it would look good on my resume, leadership experience and all that. My friends in the history department thought it was hilarious. "You'll be the one running from bears with your nose stuck in a book," they joked. They weren't entirely wrong about my bookish nature, but they didn't know about my childhood. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, I'd spent countless hours exploring the woods behind our house. My father, an avid hunter, had taught me how to track animals, read weather patterns, and navigate by the stars. Those skills had gone dormant during my college years, but they weren't forgotten. Something about returning to the forest called to that part of me, even if I didn't recognize it at the time. Camp Firewood sat nestled in the Adirondacks, far enough from civilization that the night sky blazed with stars you'd never see in the city. The main lodge was a massive log structure that had stood since the 1950s, its wood weathered to a deep gray. Surrounding it were 12 cabins arranged in a rough semicircle, each housing 8 campers and 1 counselor. My cabin, number 12, stood slightly apart from the others, closest to the tree line. At the time, I liked the isolation. Later, I would curse it. The other counselors arrived in early June for training week. Kyle Reynolds was impossible to miss, 6'4" with a mop of unruly red hair and a beat-up guitar perpetually slung across his back. He'd been coming to Camp Firewood since he was a kid, first as a camper, then as a junior counselor, and now as head of outdoor activities. The guitar wasn't just for show. He could make that thing sing, turning even the most mundane campfire into something magical. Elizabeth Lizzie Morrison arrived last, rolling up in an ancient Volkswagen Beetle packed to the roof with supplies. She had this infectious energy about her, the kind that could turn a rainy day into an adventure. Short and athletic, with sun-bleached hair usually pulled back in a messy ponytail, she specialized in getting through to the problem kids, the ones who were homesick or angry, or just scared of being away from home for the first time. That first week, before the campers arrived, we spent our days learning emergency procedures, memorizing schedules, and getting to know each other. The nights were ours, and we'd often gather on the main lodge's wraparound porch, sharing stories and dreams. Kyle would play his guitar, everything from classic rock to his own compositions. Lizzie would lead us in ridiculous camp songs she swore the kids would love. I found myself opening up more than I usually did, sharing stories about my father's hunting trips and my own childhood adventures in the woods. "You're not nearly as much of a bookworm as you pretend to be," Lizzie observed one night, her eyes twinkling in the porch light. "I bet there's quite an adventurer hiding under those glasses." I didn't know how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The campers arrived on a Sunday, a convoy of buses kicking up dust along the narrow access road. Watching them pile out, clutching duffel bags and sleeping bags, their faces a mix of excitement and apprehension, I felt a surge of responsibility. These kids' parents had entrusted us with their safety, their happiness. It was a duty I took seriously. The first few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with flag raising and breakfast in the main lodge. Days were filled with activities, swimming in the lake, nature hikes, arts and crafts, sports. Evenings brought campfires, ghost stories, and the soft sound of children whispering in their bunks after lights out. I found myself enjoying it more than I'd expected. There was something satisfying about teaching kids about the natural world, watching their eyes widen as they learned to identify bird calls or track animal prints. Kyle taught me more about the local flora and fauna, while I shared my knowledge of the area's history. Lizzie seemed to have an endless supply of activities that could turn any lesson into a game, but there were odd moments, things that didn't quite fit. Like the day we found a perfect circle of dead vegetation near the hiking trail, the ground blackened as if burned but without any sign of fire. Or the times when the lake would go completely still, even as the wind rustled through the trees around it. Small things, easy to dismiss individually, but they began to form a pattern. The first real warning came during a night patrol. As counselors, we took turns walking the grounds after lights out, making sure no campers were sneaking between cabins or trying to raid the kitchen. It was my turn, and I was making my final round before turning in. The moon was full that night, casting sharp shadows across the camp. I just checked the boathouse and was heading back toward the cabins when I heard it. Footsteps in the woods, heavy and deliberate. They weren't the quick, furtive steps of a teenage camper trying to be sneaky. These were slow, measured, as if whatever was making them didn't care about being heard. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness between the trees. The footsteps continued, parallel to my position but just out of sight. Then they stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, rasping sound, like someone trying to speak with damaged vocal cords. "Hello?" I called out, proud that my voice remained steady. "This is Counselor Thomas. Identify yourself." The response was not what I expected. A laugh, if you could call it that, more like the sound of metal scraping against stone, followed by words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Time to play, Edward, time to play." I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran all the way back to my cabin, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning I mentioned it to Kyle and Lizzie over breakfast. Kyle's usual easy smile faded as I described what I'd heard. "There are stories," he said finally, glancing around to make sure no campers were within earshot. About this place, about the woods, things the camp directors don't tell new counselors because they don't want to scare them off. What kind of stories? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. That's when Kyle told us about Old Man Harrington. According to Kyle, William Harrington had been the camp's groundskeeper from its opening in 1952 until his disappearance in 1978. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, living in a small cabin deep in the woods beyond the camp's boundaries. The campers rarely saw him. He did most of his work at night, maintaining the grounds, fixing equipment, keeping the generator running. The older counselors say he started acting strange in his last few months, Kyle explained, his voice low. They'd find him standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness for hours. Sometimes he'd be muttering to himself in what sounded like Latin, and the symbols. Symbols? Lizzie leaned forward, her breakfast forgotten. He started carving these weird marks into trees, old Germanic runes, some people said, or something even older. The camp director at the time, Mr. Wheeler, asked him about them, but Harrington just said they were necessary for protection. I felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. Protection from what? Kyle shrugged. That's the thing, he never said. Then one night in August '78 he just vanished, left everything in his cabin, clothes, personal belongings, even his wallet. The police searched for weeks but never found a trace of him. The official report said he probably got lost in the woods and died from exposure, but what? But people kept seeing him, counselors, campers, even some hikers. They'd catch glimpses of a tall figure standing among the trees, wearing the old groundskeeper's uniform, and always near those carved symbols. I wanted to dismiss it as just another camp ghost story, but something about it nagged at me. Maybe it was the specificity of the details, or the way Kyle's usual joking manner had completely disappeared while telling it. The weirdest part, he continued, is what they found in his cabin afterward. The walls were covered in those same symbols, floor to ceiling, and there were journals, dozens of them, filled with writings about something he called the waiting dark. The police took them as evidence, but they disappeared from the station a few days later. Lizzie rolled her eyes, but I could tell she was unsettled. Come on, Kyle. This is just another story to scare the kids around the campfire. Maybe, he admitted. But have you noticed how quiet the woods get sometimes? How the animals all go silent at once, like they're listening for something? And those dead patches we keep finding. Before he could continue, the breakfast bell rang, signaling the start of the day's activities. We had to put the conversation aside as campers began filing into the dining hall, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. That day, during a nature hike with my group, I found myself paying more attention to the trees, looking for any sign of carved symbols. I didn't find any, but I did notice something else. The woods seemed deeper somehow, the shadows between the trees darker and more substantial than they should have been in broad daylight. The catalyst came 3 weeks after that breakfast conversation. July had brought a heat wave, making the days long and sticky. We'd adjusted the schedule to include more water activities, letting the kids spend extra time in the lake to beat the heat. It was during one of these extended swim sessions that I first noticed something was off. I was on lifeguard duty, scanning the water from my elevated chair when I saw it, a dark shape moving beneath the surface, too large to be a swimmer. It moved with purpose, gliding smoothly through the deeper water before disappearing into the murky center of the lake. I called the kids out of the water, citing an approaching thunderstorm that I could see building on the horizon. As they trudged up the beach, grumbling about the early end to their swim, I kept my eyes on the water. The surface was perfectly still now, unnaturally so, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. That evening, during the counselor meeting, Lizzie seemed distracted. She kept glancing out the window toward the woods, rubbing her arms as if cold despite the summer heat. "Everything okay?" I asked her afterward. "Just tired," she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And, I don't know, probably being silly, but I keep feeling like someone's watching me, from the trees." I thought about telling her what I'd seen in the lake, but decided against it. No need to add to her unease. "Want me to walk you back to your cabin?" She shook her head. "Thanks, but I'm fine. Just need a good night's sleep." That was the last time I saw her. The next morning, Lizzie didn't show up for breakfast. Kyle checked her cabin and found it empty, the bed unslept in. We searched the entire camp before calling the sheriff, trying to keep the campers occupied and unaware that something was wrong. Sheriff Owens arrived with 4 deputies and a K-9 unit. He was a tall, weathered man with eyes that had seen too much. As he interviewed Kyle and me, I noticed him repeatedly glancing toward the woods, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Any idea where she might have gone?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already had a theory. "No," Kyle answered. "She was tired last night, said she was heading straight to bed, but—" He hesitated. "But what, son?" "She said she felt like someone was watching her, from the woods." The sheriff's expression darkened. "When did the strange things start happening? The dead vegetation, the unusual sounds?" We stared at him. "How did you know about those?" I asked. He ignored the question. "I need you to think carefully. Have either of you seen any marks on the trees, symbols, carvings, anything like that?" Kyle and I exchanged glances. "You know about Harrington," Kyle said. It wasn't a question. "I know more than I wish I did," the sheriff replied grimly. "I was a deputy during the original investigation, saw things that never made it into the official report, things that shouldn't have been possible." Before he could elaborate, one of the deputies called out from the tree line. They'd found something. Lizzie's flashlight lying in a patch of blackened earth. Next to it was a tree bearing fresh carvings, the symbols still wet with sap. The search expanded into the woods, but as darkness approached, the sheriff called it off until morning. "Nobody goes into those woods after dark," he ordered. "Nobody." Kyle and I sat on the main lodge's porch that night, unable to sleep. The usual chorus of night insects was absent, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional distant sound, something between a laugh and a scream. "We have to find her," Kyle said finally. I knew what he was suggesting. The sheriff said, "I don't care what the sheriff said. This is Lizzie we're talking about. She'd do the same for us." He was right, of course. We waited until the deputy posted to watch the camp had done his rounds, then slipped into the darkness, armed only with flashlights and a desperate hope. The woods seemed different at night, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching like grasping hands. We followed a trail of carved symbols, each one fresher than the last, leading us deeper into the forest. The air grew colder with each step, our breath visible despite the summer night. Then we heard it, the same rasping voice I'd heard on patrol. "Time to play, children. Time to play." What happened next still haunts my nightmares. The creature that emerged from the darkness defied description, a shifting mass of shadows and angles that hurt to look at directly. It moved like smoke but had substance, its form rippling with faces that appeared and disappeared, human faces, animal faces, and things that were neither. The stench hit us first, decay and ozone, mixed with something metallic. The temperature dropped so low our flashlight beams became visible in the frigid air. And then it spoke, not with one voice but with many, including Lizzie's. "Join us, Edward. Join us in the waiting dark." 22 years have passed since that summer. Camp Firewood never reopened. The official report listed Lizzie as a missing person, one of many who have vanished in those woods over the decades. Kyle and I tried to tell the truth at first, but who would believe us? I still dream about it sometimes, the faces in the darkness, the symbols on the trees, the voice that spoke with many tongues. I've spent years researching similar incidents, finding patterns and disappearances across the country's dark places. The thing that took Lizzie wasn't Old Man Harrington's ghost. It was something older, something that had been waiting in those woods long before the camp was built, something that's still waiting. I tell this story not to frighten, but to warn. There are places in this world that don't belong to us, where the darkness isn't just the absence of light, but something alive and hungry. If you find yourself in such a place, when the animals go quiet and the shadows move wrong, don't ignore your instincts. Run, because sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they know your name. Kyle and I stood frozen as the creature towered over us, its form constantly shifting like television static given mass. Where its body met the ground, frost spread in crystalline patterns, and the air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. "Join us," it spoke again, Lizzie's voice now mixed with others. old voices, young voices, some that didn't sound human at all. We are the waiting dark. We are what was here before. We are what will remain. The beam of my flashlight passed through its form, creating prismatic explosions of color that revealed glimpses of impossible geometries within. In those brief flashes, I saw faces I recognized, missing hikers from news reports, lost campers from years past, and there, shifting in and out of view, Lizzie's face, her eyes wide and pleading. Kyle moved first, grabbing my arm. We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush. Behind us, that terrible scraping laugh echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of something large moving in pursuit, not running but flowing, like liquid shadow across the forest floor. The woods seemed to come alive around us, trees bent inward, their branches reaching like claws. Roots lifted from the ground, trying to tangle our feet. The very air felt thick, resisting our movement as if we were running underwater. "The symbols," Kyle gasped as we ran. "Their protection. Harrington was trying to warn us." He was right. I noticed that wherever we passed one of the carved trees, the oppressive presence seemed to weaken slightly. The old groundskeeper hadn't been mad. He'd been trying to contain something, to ward off an ancient evil that had claimed these woods as its own. We burst into a clearing and found ourselves facing the old cabin we'd discovered earlier. Its windows glowed with an unnatural blue light, and symbols like the ones on the trees covered every inch of its walls. "Inside!" I shouted, though everything in me screamed against entering that place. We slammed through the door and found ourselves in a room that defied physics. The interior was vastly larger than the cabin's external dimensions should have allowed, stretching away into shadows our flashlights couldn't penetrate. More symbols covered the walls, floor, and ceiling, glowing with a faint phosphorescence. And there, in the center of it all, was Lizzie. She hung suspended in midair, surrounded by a cocoon of shifting darkness. Her eyes were open but unseeing, and her mouth moved silently, forming words in a language that had never been meant for human tongues. The thing flowed into the cabin behind us, its form expanding to fill the impossible space. "You cannot save her," it said, now using Harrington's voice. "She is part of us now, as you will be." But something caught my eye, a journal lying open on a table near Lizzie. Its pages were covered in Harrington's handwriting, and among the symbols and diagrams was something that looked like a ritual of banishment. While Kyle distracted the creature by shining his flashlight through its form, I lunged for the journal. The words were in Latin, similar to texts I'd studied in my history courses. As the thing reached for us with limbs that bent in impossible ways, I began to read. The effect was immediate. The symbols on the walls flared with brilliant light, and the creature recoiled, its form becoming unstable. Lizzie's suspended body jerked as if struck by electricity. "Keep reading!" Kyle shouted, backing toward Lizzie. I continued the incantation, my voice growing stronger as the words took effect. The creature writhed, its many voices screaming in discord. The temperature in the cabin rose rapidly as its power weakened. Kyle reached Lizzie and pulled her from the dissolving cocoon of darkness. She collapsed into his arms, gasping and shaking, but alive. The creature made one final attempt to reach us, its form condensing into something almost solid, a towering mass of angles and faces that hurt to look at. But the symbol's light grew blinding, and with a sound like reality tearing, it was pulled apart, drawn back into whatever dark dimension it had emerged from. The official investigation concluded with more questions than answers. The cabin itself had vanished by the time we led the sheriff's team back to it, leaving only a circle of scorched earth. Lizzie recovered in the hospital, though she never spoke about what she experienced during her time in the creature's grasp. Camp Firewood closed permanently that summer. The land was declared a restricted area, though no official reason was ever given. Kyle and I spent years researching what we'd encountered, finding similar stories and folklore across the world, tales of places where reality grows thin, where ancient things wait in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. Harrington's journals, which we recovered from the cabin before it vanished, revealed that he had spent years studying the entity, learning its patterns and developing ways to contain it. He hadn't disappeared. He had sacrificed himself to strengthen the symbolic barriers that kept it confined to those woods. 22 years later, I still can't walk in dense forest without feeling watched. I've dedicated part of my academic career to studying similar phenomena, though I'm careful about how I present my research. Some truths are too dangerous to share widely. Kyle became a park ranger, using his position to identify and monitor other potential thin places in the wilderness. Lizzie moved to Arizona, as far from deep woods as she could get. We stay in touch, bound by an experience that changed us forever. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the single page I saved from Harrington's journal. The symbols still glow faintly in the dark, a reminder that there are things in this world older and darker than we can comprehend. Things that wait in the shadows between trees, in the depths of still lakes, in places where the boundaries between here and elsewhere grow thin. If you find yourself in such a place, where the animals go quiet, where shadows move against the light, where ancient symbols mark the trees, remember this story. Remember that not all darkness is empty, and not all paths should be followed. And if you hear a voice calling your name from the woods, no matter how familiar it sounds, no matter how much you want to answer, run, because the waiting dark is patient, and it remembers every name it learns. In my 4 years as a fire lookout in the Gila National Forest, the solitude never bothered me. The position attracted a certain type of person, someone who could find comfort in the absence of others, who could derive meaning from the subtle rhythms of nature rather than the chaos of human interaction. I'm not sure if it was a hermetic tendency buried deep within my psyche, or just the satisfaction of pure independence, but solitude was never the issue until that peculiar May evening. Most of my days at the tower were spent observing the vast expanse of wilderness through my binoculars, meticulously scribbling notes about weather patterns and smoke sightings, and occasionally radioing to the base station about potential concerns. The job demanded attention to detail, patience, and most importantly, a steady mind that wouldn't crack under the weight of isolation. I'd become intimately familiar with the monotonous lull of wind whispering through ponderosa pines, and the methodical creaking of wood under the weight of time. The tower itself had become an extension of my being. Every loose floorboard, every squeaking hinge, every panel of sun-bleached wood was mapped in my mind like the lines on my palm. However, it was during one of these routine observations, just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged horizon, that I spotted something unsettling. A series of irregular clearings began to appear in patches below, precise and clean cuts through the trees, as if scooped out by some meticulous machine. These weren't the random destruction of natural phenomena or the organized harvest of logging operations. They followed a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, yet devoid of any practical purpose. I reached for my radio, fingers trembling slightly as I keyed the mic, but received only a static murmur in response, the sound seeming to mock my growing unease. Communication problems weren't unusual in these remote reaches of the forest, where mountains and valleys played havoc with radio signals, but this silence felt different, invasive somehow. The click-click-click of failed transmission leaving a void within me that seemed to expand with each passing moment. That night, everything changed when I met Red in person for the first time. His post was on the southern ridge, about 15 miles from my position, and I knew him only by voice over the radio. A gruff but friendly presence that helped break up the monotony of our solitary vigils. At around 3 in the morning, there was a frantic banging on my cabin door that sent my heart racing. It was Red, standing there wide-eyed and drenched in sweat, his usually composed demeanor shattered by something I couldn't yet comprehend. Between gasps for air, his words tumbled out in a desperate rush as he spoke of an escaped convict rumored to be roaming our woods. This wasn't just any fugitive, but a man so completely unhinged from reality that he'd adapted to live like a beast among the trees, surviving through means that Red could barely bring himself to describe. The story would have seemed absurd in any other context, but there was something in Red's eyes, a raw fear that stripped away any doubt about the gravity of his words. As dawn broke, casting long shadows through the trees, we found ourselves trailing traces of what could only be human activity, remnants of gnawed bone that bore marks too deliberate for animal teeth. and a shelter clumsily woven from branches in a way that spoke of human intelligence warped by isolation. We weren't trackers or hunters. Our expertise lay in watching from afar, in maintaining that comfortable distance between observer and observed. We were accustomed to stillness, to the patient act of surveillance, not this invasive dance with an unknown interloper who seemed to mock our very purpose as guardians of the forest. The trail led us deeper into the wilderness, each step taking us further from the safety of our towers and the civilization they represented. We followed until we stumbled upon a scene both gruesome and perplexing. Animals laid out in patterns across a clearing, their bodies arranged with a deliberate precision that spoke of something far more disturbing than mere predation. These were acts not just predatory but artistic, a twisted form of expression that sent chills down our spines. No bear or wildcat had a predilection for such morbid displays. This was something else entirely. Red insisted we head back and wait for backup, his voice carrying a tremor that revealed just how far we'd strayed from our comfort zone. But my nerves had transformed into a strange sort of determination. Curiosity sometimes trumps fear even when it shouldn't, pushing us past the boundaries of safety into territory where nightmares take physical form. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of tension and discovery, as we traced increasingly inconspicuous signs of presence during daylight hours, only to huddle together at night discussing what someone capable of such disturbing artistry might do if cornered. Each morning brought new evidence of our quarry's activities, each discovery more unsettling than the last. Then came our encounter, the climax unstrung from any script nature might write, a moment that would forever alter our understanding of what lurks in the shadows of civilization. As we were scouring another grotesque display, this one fresher than the others, the blood still tacky on leaves and bark, a sound unfamiliar yet distinctly human rasped behind us. It was a harsh breathing that seemed neither struggling nor entirely steady, but rather the calculated respiration of a predator sizing up its prey. We spun around to find nothing but the oppressive presence of absence, that peculiar sensation of being watched that sends primitive warnings coursing through your nervous system. The feeling of eyes burrowing into your back unseen is perhaps one of humanity's oldest fears, and in that moment it consumed us entirely. Our breaths became ragged echoes of each other as we strained our senses, trying to discern any movement through thickets scarred by invisible hands. Our group stood motionless, waiting for a sign of movement in the brush, knowing with crushing certainty that we had no reception in these woods. The risks we'd taken in pursuing this investigation now seemed foolish in the extreme, but it was far too late for regrets. Whispers among us grew tense as seconds stretched into an eternity of anticipated horror. "Stay close," Red ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. Those were the only words any of us could manage as our focus fixed on the unseen threat that seemed to circle us like a shark testing its prey. The underbrush rustled to our left, a slight but deliberate agitation that drew our attention with magnetic force. There it was, an outline in the thicket, large and hunched in a way that seemed both human and bestial. As it stepped into a sliver of light filtering through the canopy, details became apparent that my mind struggled to process. A mass of tangled hair covered its body, arms long and corded with muscle beneath matted fur, fingers ending in claws caked with dark remnants that I refused to contemplate too deeply. But it was its eyes that stood out most, undeniably human yet feral, reflecting a menacing intelligence that saw us not just as prey, but as subjects in whatever twisted narrative it had constructed in its fractured psyche. It moved toward Red with a fluidity that belied its monstrous appearance, each step calculated yet somehow primal. We shouted warnings that seemed to dissipate in the thick air, sound itself seeming futile against such a primordial force. The creature lunged with impossible speed, and Red fell amid screams that pierced the stillness of dawn, his voice cutting off with a terrible finality that spurred the rest of us into panicked flight. Blood colored the earth where he fell, a stark reminder of nature's capacity for violence when merged with human madness. I ran with desperate breath, not daring to look back, my mind filled with the image of those eyes and the knowledge that something fundamental had changed in my understanding of solitude. We reached the town by nightfall, our bodies aching with spent adrenaline and our minds struggling to process what we'd witnessed. We reported what happened, describing Red's end at the hands of an unknown animal. But skepticism met our tale at every turn. How could we explain what we'd seen? What words could capture the horror of a being that straddled the line between human and beast? Time passed, but peace did not return to those woods or to our minds. I often passed by Red's place in the years that followed, the abandoned tower standing as a monument to the truth that some horrors of nature defy explanation and continue their reign long after their victims are mourned and their stories fade into whispers in the woods. The solitude that had once been my comfort now felt like a veil, behind which something waited, watching with those terribly human eyes. Lightning flashes through my lookout tower, casting the Oregon wilderness in sharp, stuttering relief against the roiling sky. The ancient Douglas firs and towering western hemlocks transform into skeletal fingers clawing at the clouds with each electric burst. I wasn't fond of storms, but they came with the territory of being a fire lookout in the Pacific Northwest. My name is Merritt, and I'd spent the past 3 seasons watching over these stretches of timber-rich land from my perch 70 feet above the forest floor. The isolation had never bothered me before. I'd chosen this job precisely for its solitude. But something about these violent tempests made the loneliness press in like a physical weight. My only company was a handheld radio that crackled with occasional weather updates and a collection of dog-eared books left behind by my predecessors, lookouts too bored or too scared to complete their seasons. Some had lasted mere weeks before the isolation broke them, leaving behind paperback mysteries and survival guides like breadcrumbs marking their retreat to civilization. On nights like this, when the wind howled through the firefinder's azimuth ring and created sounds resembling whispers that snuck through the cracks in my cabin, I understood their exodus. Hailstones pelted the metal roof like angry fists demanding entry, their impacts reverberating through the small space until I could feel each strike in my teeth. It started with a single report crackling through my radio, a hiker missing somewhere in my jurisdiction, last seen on the Thunder Creek Trail 3 days prior. Such disappearances weren't uncommon in these parts where the wilderness could swallow the unprepared whole, but something about this one left me unsettled. The weather hindered search and rescue teams, forcing them to wade through understory turned treacherous by rain and wind. I tuned to their frequencies, catching fragments of their communications through the static, visibly altered trails, unusual markings on trees, traces of blood, but no body. The next day dawned clear and crisp, nature's previous treachery forgotten beneath azure skies that stretched endlessly over the evergreen canopy. As I surveyed through my binoculars for any signals of fire or distress among the conifers, movement caught my eye. A man appeared beneath my tower, his figure small but distinct against the forest floor. He introduced himself as Halvard, though something about his demeanor set my instincts humming like a plucked wire. His clothes were oddly pristine for someone who claimed to have been searching the backcountry for his friend, the missing hiker perhaps, and his eyes never quite met mine as he spoke. Before I could radio in his presence to search and rescue, he vanished back into the tree line as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only an unease that settled like a stone in my stomach. The following evenings were spent meticulously charting any anomalies and changes in foliage patterns from my vantage point, noting how a small clearing, usually teeming with deer and elk, lay eerily deserted. In these remote stretches of wilderness, appearances often proved deceptive, and survival depended on reading the subtle signs nature provided. Days after Halvard's unsettling visit, another storm system rolled in with a vengeance that made the previous tempest seem tame by comparison. Lightning strikes were close enough for me to feel their electricity in my teeth, each flash followed by thunder that rattled the windows in their frames. After one particularly deafening clap, my radio crackled to life with a voice stripped raw by panic. It was Halvard, and according to the broken coordinates he managed to relay, he was somewhere within a mile of my tower. His breath came in ragged gasps between words hammered out in terror, background noise suggesting he was running through dense underbrush. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my emergency flashlight and rain gear, intending to help trace his steps. Breaking protocols about remaining in the tower seemed trivial compared to the potential cost of a human life. As I descended the metal stairs into uneasy darkness, each step taking me further from safety, I realized that altruism sometimes carried its own particular brand of danger. Through gaps between massive tree trunks, my light beam caught glimpses of scarlet marks that spoke of violence rather than natural causes. This wasn't nature's artistry, but something sinister at play amidst these serene giants thrusting towards the heavens. The act of seeking Halvard meant unraveling clues I wasn't sure I wanted to understand, warding off unwanted conclusions that circled my mind like vultures over carrion. The forest floor, usually a familiar friend, felt alien beneath my boots. Missteps disguised as good intentions had led many astray in these woods, where help could be miles away and cell service non-existent. Tracing Halvard's path became increasingly difficult as his radio transmissions grew more erratic. His frantic movements turned into methodical steps as I approached a clearing he had described in his last coherent message. The radio fell silent halfway to my destination. As lightning continued to illuminate the ground before me like macabre strobe lights on a grim dance floor, shadows formed and reformed, shaping doubt into horrifying certainty. A body lay ahead, its position unnatural, divorced from life by forceful means evident even at this unintended crime scene. Though void of immediate identifiers, the clothing whispered a familiar pattern I'd noticed earlier that week. This couldn't be who I thought it was. My mind rebelled against the possibility, but intuition screamed what reason refused to accept. Suddenly, Halvard's voice rang anew, impossibly close, without any semblance of distance or electronic medium. It was a whisper now amidst nature's unrest, asking for assistance that would arrive too late, an echo of last resort born from desperation fraying into silence. I pressed the radio button repeatedly, desperately seeking response. None came. The dead silence that followed amplified the urgency of the situation. My feet carried me forward until I stumbled upon the body. It was Halvard, unmistakably and irreversibly lifeless. For a moment I stood frozen, processing the grotesque tableau before me. Though instinct pushed me to check for signs of life, the extent of his injuries made it clear he was beyond help. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone, knowing the gesture was likely futile given the spotty coverage in these parts. As I scanned the area for any sign of movement, the ancient trees swayed innocently in the wind, offering no indication of the lurking danger that had to be nearby. By some miracle, my phone showed a single bar of service. The operator's voice cut through my concentration like a knife. 911, what's your emergency? I hurriedly explained the situation, trying to conceal the rising panic in my voice. Halvard is dead. I'm in the woods west of Old Birch Road near Fire Tower 7. The operator's professional calm steadied me slightly. We're sending units now. Stay on the line. While waiting for help to arrive, noises from deeper in the woods caught my attention, a rustling distinct from wildlife foraging or nocturnal creatures going about their business. Safety suddenly became my paramount concern. My decision not to venture further into the darkness sprang not from cowardice, but from a primal understanding of survival. Whatever had done this to Halvard displayed violence and strength surpassing any animal I'd encountered in my years of service. As time trickled by with excruciating slowness, every shadow seemed to harbor potential threats. Distant sirens grew steadily louder until red and blue lights flickered between the trees, a welcome beacon of outside reality penetrating this nightmarish ordeal. First responders swarmed the area, securing the scene with practiced efficiency. Questions poured over me like the relentless rain that had finally begun to slacken. "What exactly did you see?" one officer pressed, notepad ready. "Nothing," I replied honestly, the truth suffocating because there was nothing tangible to report beyond the grim evidence before us. Just visceral fear suggesting something grotesque and calculating moved with purpose through these woods. Hours later, investigators pieced together a preliminary profile of our predator. Large, based on the depth and spacing of footprints found near Halvard's body. Powerful, judging from how the victim had been moved post-mortem. And unnervingly smart, having avoided leaving behind clear evidence of its nature or origin. In their methodical search of the surrounding area, they found only tantalizing fragments of evidence. Shreds of clothing snagged on underbrush contained traces of what might have been gray fur or flesh, though lab results would later prove inconclusive. Nothing definitive emerged, but whatever had stalked these woods was certainly not human. Weary and overwhelmed by grief and shock, I returned to my tower as dawn approached, carrying a burden heavier than mere physical fatigue. Halvard had become another victim of something that existed in an unfathomable realm that had momentarily clashed with ours. In memory of Halvard and others lost to the wilderness, authorities cordoned off that section of the forest and placed warning signs with words that seemed woefully inadequate, given what might still lurk within those ancient woods. To this day, I remain in my tower, watching over these lands with new eyes, knowing that somewhere below, something walks these forests that defies our understanding of what's possible, still not fully comprehending what hunted us that stormy night. The summer of 1998 started like any other for me, David Rodriguez. At 24, I was a broke grad student in environmental science, looking for a way to earn some cash during the break while hopefully catching up on some much-needed rest. When I saw the posting for a counselor position at Camp Clearwater in the Adirondacks, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to combine work with a dose of nostalgia. Little did I know that this summer job would become a haunting chapter in my life, one that would fundamentally change who I was and how I viewed the world around me. Camp Clearwater sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. The main lodge was a sturdy log building that had weathered decades of summers, its wood worn smooth by countless hands. A dozen cabins were scattered in a rough semicircle around it, connected by winding dirt paths that glowed amber in the setting sun. The lake that gave the camp its name was a mirror-like expanse that reflected the mountains perfectly on calm mornings. It was postcard perfect, the kind of place parents dreamed of sending their kids for a traditional summer camp experience. My fellow counselors were an eclectic bunch, each bringing their own flavor to the camp's atmosphere. Julian Morrison was our resident artist, a laid-back soul who seemed to have walked straight out of a Woodstock documentary. His tie-dyed shirts and acoustic guitar were as much a part of the camp's soundtrack as the crickets at night. He had a way with the more creative kids, always ready with an encouraging word or a new song to teach. Kendra Matthews was cut from different cloth entirely, an ex-college athlete who ran the sports programs with military precision but had a surprisingly gentle touch when dealing with homesick campers. Her no-nonsense attitude balanced out Julian's dreamier approach perfectly. Then there was Mike Henderson, the camp's jack-of-all-trades who seemed to have been there since the beginning of time. His weathered face and calloused hands told stories of countless repairs and improvements to the camp's facilities. He knew every creaking floorboard, every loose window latch, and every quirk of the ancient plumbing system. The kids loved him because he always had a story ready. Tales of bears outwitted, storms weathered, and mysteries solved. Looking back, I wonder if his stories were meant to prepare us for what was coming, like ancient warnings wrapped in the guise of entertainment. My cabin housed 8 boys, all around 12 years old, each bringing their own personality to our little community. Tommy Chen was the quiet one, always watching and thinking before he spoke. He had a way of noticing things others missed, which would later prove both a blessing and a curse. Jake Miller was our resident comedian, always ready with a joke or prank to break the tension. Sarah Peterson led the girls' cabin across the way, her group every bit as energetic and challenging as mine. The dynamics between the cabins created a familiar rhythm to our days: competition during activities, collaboration during camp-wide events, and the occasional good-natured rivalry. The first few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with the blast of Mike's ancient bugle, followed by breakfast in the mess hall where sleepy-eyed kids slowly came to life over plates of pancakes and eggs. Days were filled with activities: swimming in the crystal-clear lake, archery lessons where kids learned the satisfaction of hitting a target, and hiking trips that taught them about the local flora and fauna. I found myself settling into the role of mentor and guardian, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching these young minds engage with the natural world around them. But there were early warning signs, subtle at first, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Items began disappearing from cabins, small things at first, a flashlight here, a candy bar there. We assumed it was typical camp mischief, perhaps older kids playing pranks on the younger ones. The missing items were logged in Mike's notebook, more out of procedure than concern. Looking back, I should have noticed the pattern, the way the disappearances seemed to radiate outward from the forest's edge, like ripples in a pond. The first real hint that something was wrong came during a typically peaceful night in late June. Tommy woke me up, his face pale in the moonlight that filtered through our cabin's window. He described seeing a figure moving between the trees, something that walked like a man but didn't quite move right. I did what any responsible counselor would do. I assured him it was probably just shadows playing tricks on his eyes, or maybe a deer wandering close to camp. But even as I spoke the words, I felt a nagging doubt. The woods seemed different that night, the darkness between the trees deeper, more absolute. The next morning, Julian and I found the tracks by the lake. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, human in shape but distorted, as if made by someone dragging their feet. The stride length was impossibly long, and there was an asymmetry to them that suggested their maker was either injured or moving in a very strange way. We tried to laugh it off, making jokes about Bigfoot and local legends, but I caught Julian glancing back at the woods more than once during that day's activities. The tracks disappeared into the undergrowth, leading away from camp and into the deeper forest, where the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. The incident with Emma marked the turning point. We were having one of our regular campfire nights, the kind where ghost stories and marshmallows created that perfect blend of scary and sweet that kids love. Kendra was in the middle of a particularly effective tale about a haunted canoe when the scream cut through the night like a knife. We found Emma trembling in her cabin, describing hands that had reached through the window, long, dirty fingers that had tried to grab her arm. The window screen was intact, but there were smudges on the glass that looked disturbingly like handprints. That night changed everything. The carefree atmosphere of summer camp was replaced by something more primal, a growing awareness that we were not alone in these woods. I began taking night watches, sitting on my cabin's porch with a flashlight and a baseball bat, scanning the tree line for movement. The kids picked up on our tension, becoming jumpy and clingy. Even the most mundane sounds, a branch scratching against a roof, the hoot of an owl, took on sinister implications. It was during one of these watches that I first saw him. The figure emerged from the shadows like a piece of darkness taking human form. He was tall, impossibly tall, with matted hair and clothes that hung in tatters from his gaunt frame. But it was his eyes that haunted me. They reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's, glowing with an unnatural intensity. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other across the clearing. Then he was gone, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The discovery of Tommy's empty bunk sent the camp into chaos. One minute he was there, safely tucked into his sleeping bag, and the next he had vanished without a trace. The search that followed was intense. Sheriff's deputies with tracking dogs, volunteers from the nearby town, even a helicopter scanning the forest from above. But it was Kendra and I who found the first real clue, stumbling upon that makeshift camp in the woods. The sight of Tommy's backpack hanging from a tree branch like some twisted trophy made my blood run cold. The week that followed was a nightmare of waiting and searching, of trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while knowing one of our kids was out there somewhere. The other campers were sent home early, their summer cut short by fear and uncertainty. Those of us who remained felt like we were living in a shadow world, going through the motions of closing down the camp while our minds were constantly in the woods, wondering, worrying. Finding Tommy alive was a miracle, but it was also the beginning of understanding the true horror of what we'd been dealing with. The man they caught, Daryl Jacobs, was more animal than human after years of living in the wilderness. His story came out in bits and pieces during the investigation. A history of mental illness, a series of violent incidents, and finally a retreat into the woods where he had watched our camp for months, planning, waiting. The image of Tommy tied to that tree, weak but alive, is forever burned into my memory, along with the wild, feral look in Jacob's eyes when they finally caught him. The years that followed brought changes for all of us. Tommy, showing remarkable resilience, eventually returned to Camp Clearwater as a counselor himself, turning his trauma into a source of strength for others. Julian left the camping industry altogether, moving to Seattle, where he now teaches music in an elementary school. Kendra stayed in outdoor education, running a wilderness therapy program for troubled teens. Mike retired but still lives near the camp, keeping an eye on things during the off-season. As for me, I find myself drawn back to the wilderness despite everything, or perhaps because of it. My work as a wildlife biologist takes me into remote areas where the line between civilization and wilderness grows thin. I've learned to respect the darkness between the trees, to understand that nature contains both beauty and danger in equal measure. The events of that summer taught me that the real monsters aren't the bears or wolves I study, but the darkness that can lurk in human hearts. Sometimes, on nights when I'm camping alone for research, I'll hear something moving in the darkness beyond my fire's light. The old fear rises up, but it's different now, tempered by experience and understanding. I think about Tommy, about how he found the strength to return to the place of his trauma and transform it into something positive. I think about all the kids who've passed through Camp Clearwater since then, learning about nature and themselves in those same woods where we once faced such terror. The camp still operates today, though with better security measures and stricter protocols. The story of that summer has become part of its lore, whispered around campfires but never officially acknowledged. Sometimes I visit, watching new generations of campers create their own memories under those ancient trees. The forest has healed, showing no signs of the darkness that once lurked within it. But those of us who were there that summer, we remember. We carry the knowledge that wilderness is more than just trees and animals. It's a mirror that reflects back both the best and worst of human nature. Every summer I get a letter from Tommy. He tells me about his experiences as a counselor, about the kids he works with and the lessons he shares. He never directly mentions what happened to him, but between the lines I can read the message that facing our fears and helping others face theirs is perhaps the most important lesson anyone can learn. The woods that once held such terror for him have become a place of healing and growth, not just for him, but for the countless children he guides through their own summers of discovery. Looking back on that summer of 1998, I realize it was more than just a series of terrifying events. It was a turning point, a moment when the comfortable veneer of civilization peeled back to reveal something darker beneath. But it also showed me the incredible resilience of the human spirit, especially in the young. Tommy's transformation from victim to mentor, the way the camp community rallied together in crisis, and even the strange, sad story of Daryl Jacobs himself. All of it speaks to the complex relationship between humanity and wilderness, between light and dark, between fear and courage. Today, Camp Clearwater continues its mission of connecting young people with nature, though with a deeper awareness of both its beauty and its dangers. The lake still reflects the mountains, the trees still whisper in the wind, and around campfires counselors still tell stories, though perhaps with a bit more understanding of the thin line between fiction and reality. And somewhere in those woods, the memories of that summer linger like shadows, reminding us that the greatest adventures often come with the greatest risks, and that sometimes facing our fears is the only way to truly overcome them. 25 years have passed since that fateful summer, and the impact of those events continues to ripple through our lives in unexpected ways. Last month, I received an invitation that brought it all flooding back. Camp Clearwater was celebrating its 75th anniversary, and they were hosting a special reunion for former counselors and staff. The email came from Tommy, now the camp's director, asking me to be the keynote speaker at their anniversary ceremony. Driving up that familiar winding road through the Adirondacks felt like stepping through time. The ancient maples still formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead, their leaves casting dancing shadows on the ground. The camp itself had been modernized. New solar panels glinted on cabin roofs, and a state-of-the-art indoor activity center stood where the old craft shed used to be. But the essence remained unchanged. The smell of pine needles, the distant call of loons on the lake, the way the mountains seemed to embrace the valley like protective giants. Julian was the first person I saw when I pulled into the parking lot. His tie-dye shirts had been replaced by a professor's blazer, but his eyes still held that same gentle warmth. He'd brought his guitar naturally, though his once black hair was now streaked with silver. Kendra arrived shortly after, her athletic build barely changed by the years, though she moved with the measured grace of a veteran outdoor educator rather than the boundless energy of her younger self. Mike, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, sat in a rocking chair on the main lodge's porch, holding court with a group of wide-eyed current counselors. The reunion dinner that evening was a mixture of laughter and tears as we shared stories from different eras of the camp's history. Tommy, now a tall, confident man with laugh lines around his eyes, stood up to address the gathering. He spoke about the camp's evolution, about how they'd transformed the tragedy of 1998 into a foundation for building stronger safety protocols and a more comprehensive wilderness education program. But he also talked about healing, about how returning to Camp Clearwater had helped him reclaim something that Daryl Jacobs had tried to take away. After dinner, we gathered around the same fire pit where we'd sat that night when Emma screamed. The current campers were safely tucked away in their cabins, but the sound of their laughter occasionally drifted down from the hill. Julian pulled out his guitar and began playing softly, not the usual camp songs, but something more contemplative that seemed to match the mood of remembrance. "I visited him once," Tommy said quietly, poking at the fire with a stick. We all knew who he meant. Daryl Jacobs had died in the psychiatric facility 5 years ago, never having fully regained his grip on reality. I needed to understand why he did it, what made him choose me. But you know what I realized? There was no great reason. He was just a broken person who'd lost his way in the world. Understanding that helped me let go of the last of my fear. Kendra shared how the incident had influenced her wilderness therapy program. "We teach them about real dangers," she explained, "but also about resilience, about finding strength in facing your fears. Every kid who comes through my program hears about Camp Clearwater, not to scare them, but to show them that even in our darkest moments, we can find light if we stick together." As the night wore on, we were joined by other former counselors and staff members, each with their own stories of how that summer had changed them. Sarah Peterson, who'd led the girls' cabin, was now a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. Jake Miller, the former camp comedian, had become a search and rescue coordinator, turning his knowledge of the woods into a tool for helping others. The next morning, I gave my keynote speech to the entire camp community, current campers, staff, alumni, and families. Standing at the podium, looking out over the sea of faces, I saw the legacy of Camp Clearwater reflected in each person. Yes, we had faced darkness in these woods, but we had also found extraordinary light. Every scared child who found their courage, every homesick camper who discovered a second home, every teenager who learned to trust themselves in the wilderness. They were all part of a continuing story that was bigger than our one terrible summer. After the ceremony, I walked down to the lake alone. The spot where Julian and I had found those strange tracks was now a beautiful wildflower garden, planted by Tommy as a symbol of renewal. The lake was as clear as ever, reflecting the late summer sky like a mirror. A group of kids were out in canoes, their laughter carrying across the water, while their counselors watched carefully from the shore. I thought about how close the camp had come to closing after that summer. The parents' concerns, the media attention, the lawsuits. It had all nearly ended Camp Clearwater's long history, but something remarkable had happened instead. Under the leadership of Mr. Harrington and later Tommy, the camp had transformed itself. They'd added comprehensive background checks for all staff, installed modern security systems, and developed one of the most respected outdoor education programs in the country. That evening, as the reunion wound down and people began to leave, Tommy asked me to stay for one more night. We sat on the porch of his cabin, the same one where I'd once stood watch with a baseball bat, and talked until the stars came out. He showed me the journal he'd kept over the years, filled with letters from former campers who'd found healing and purpose in these woods. "You know what the real miracle is, David," he said, looking out at the darkness between the trees. "It's not that we survived that summer. It's that we learned how to help others survive their own darkness. Every kid who comes here has their own fears to face. We just show them they don't have to face them alone." Before I left the next morning, I walked the camp one last time. The fresh dew sparkled on the grass, and the early sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Near the edge of the woods, I found a new generation of counselors teaching their kids about local plants and animals. They wore modern uniforms with GPS trackers, and their first aid kits were stocked with satellite phones. But their eyes held the same mix of responsibility and wonder that I remembered feeling all those years ago. Camp Clearwater had taught us all that the wilderness, like life itself, holds both beauty and danger. The key isn't to hide from the darkness, but to face it with courage, wisdom, and the strength of community. As I drove away, watching the camp disappear in my rearview mirror, I thought about all the summers to come, all the children who would find their own stories in these woods. The shadows between the trees might still hold mysteries, but they no longer held terror. At least not the kind that can't be overcome with hope, resilience, and the enduring spirit of a place that had turned tragedy into triumph. Years later, Tommy sent me a final letter. He was retiring as camp director, passing the torch to Emma's daughter, of all people. The letter included a photo of the new welcome sign at the camp's entrance. Below the traditional "Welcome to Camp Clearwater" was a new motto, "Where courage meets nature." It seemed fitting, a reminder that the darkest chapters of our stories don't have to define their endings. Today, when people ask me about that summer of 1998, I tell them about the darkness we faced, yes, but I also tell them about the light we found, in each other, in the resilience of the human spirit, and in a place that refused to let fear have the final word. Camp Clearwater stands as a testament to the idea that sometimes the most important lessons come from our darkest moments, and that the true measure of a place or a person isn't in never facing darkness, but in how we choose to carry the light forward. The story of Camp Clearwater didn't end with my last visit. 5 years after the reunion, I received word that the camp was being considered for a special designation as a National Historic Site, not just for its longevity, but for its pioneering work in wilderness education and therapeutic outdoor programs. The application included a detailed history of the camp, including the events of 1998, now viewed through the lens of institutional resilience and transformation. Emma's daughter, Claire, had taken to her role as camp director with remarkable passion. She'd expanded Tommy's programs and added new ones, including a specialized track for children dealing with trauma. The Clearwater method, as it came to be known in outdoor education circles, became a model for camps across the country. At its core was a simple but powerful philosophy: acknowledge the wilderness in all its aspects, both beautiful and dangerous, while building the skills and confidence to thrive within it. Last month, I returned to Camp Clearwater one final time. The occasion was somber. Mike Henderson had passed away peacefully in his sleep, and his family had requested that his memorial service be held at the camp he'd loved so dearly. As I drove up that familiar road, now smoothly paved but still winding through the same ancient forests, I thought about how much had changed and how much remained eternal. The memorial service brought together generations of Clearwater alumni. Julian, now fully gray but still playing that same guitar, performed a touching rendition of "The River Flows," a song he'd written about Mike years ago. Kendra spoke about Mike's influence on her wilderness therapy work and how his practical wisdom had shaped her approach to teaching survival skills. Tommy, semi-retired but still actively involved with the camp's board, shared stories that had us alternating between tears and laughter. After the service, I walked down to the lake with Claire. The afternoon sun painted the water in shades of gold, and in the distance we could hear the sounds of children playing, the eternal soundtrack of Camp Clearwater summers. She showed me their latest addition, a nature center named after Mike, housed in a beautiful timber building that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. Inside, alongside displays about local wildlife and ecology, was a subtle but powerful exhibit about the camp's history. We debated whether to include it, Claire explained, gesturing to a small section that dealt with the events of 1998. But Mom always said that pretending bad things never happened doesn't make anyone safer. It's better to acknowledge the darkness while teaching people how to find their light. The exhibit was tastefully done. No sensationalism, just a straightforward account of what had happened and how the camp had evolved in response. Alongside it were hundreds of testimonials from campers and counselors over the years, each describing how Clearwater had helped them face their fears and find their strength. I recognized Tommy's story among them, though the names had been changed to protect privacy. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, we gathered for one last campfire. The current campers joined us, and we shared stories about Mike and about the camp through the decades. Julian taught them some of the old songs, and for a moment it felt like time had folded in on itself, past and present merging in the flickering firelight. Looking around the circle, I saw the legacy of that terrible summer transformed into something powerful and healing. There was a boy about Tommy's age sitting across from me, laughing with his friends as they roasted marshmallows. 25 years ago, such a scene might have triggered painful memories. Now it filled me with hope. The camp had installed a new tradition. At the end of each session, campers wrote letters to their future selves about what they'd learned and the challenges they'd overcome. These letters were kept in a special archive in the Nature Center, and alumni could return years later to read their own words. Claire shared some of them with me. Messages of triumph over homesickness, fear of the dark, fear of failure. Each one a small testament to the human capacity for growth. As I prepared to leave the next morning, Claire handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter Tommy had written before he retired, addressed to future generations of Clearwater counselors. With permission, I'll share its closing paragraph here. To those who will guard these woods and guide these children after us, remember that your role is not just to keep them safe, but to help them find their courage. The darkness exists, in the woods, in life, in ourselves, but so does the light. What matters is teaching them how to carry their own light forward, how to share it with others, and how to find their way back to it when shadows fall. That is the true legacy of Camp Clearwater. Today, the camp continues to thrive. The old cabins have been lovingly maintained, though now they have solar power and Wi-Fi. The lake still reflects the mountains, just as it did that summer long ago. New generations of children arrive each season, carrying their hopes and fears up that winding road through the woods. Sometimes, late at night, you can still hear the loons calling across the water. Their cries might sound mournful to some, but to those who know Clearwater's story, they sound like something else. A reminder that even in the darkest night, life continues, beauty endures, and dawn always comes. I've returned to my research in the wilderness, studying the delicate balance of nature's ecosystems, but part of me never left Camp Clearwater. It lives in every campfire I light, every trail I walk, every star-filled night I spend in the woods. The lessons we learned that summer about courage, community, and resilience have guided me through all the years since. Mike's memorial plaque now stands near the entrance to the Nature Center that bears his name. The inscription reads, "The wilderness holds many paths. The bravest choice is walking them together." Below it, someone, probably Julian, added a small carved guitar. It seems fitting somehow, this blend of wisdom and whimsy, just like the camp itself. As I write these final words, I'm sitting in my own cabin in the Adirondacks, not far from Camp Clearwater. The sun is setting, painting the sky in colors no camera could capture. In the distance, I can just make out the silhouette of the camp's new observatory dome, built last year as part of their expanded science program. Even now, the camp continues to grow, to evolve, to light new paths through the darkness. The events of 1998 will always be part of Camp Clearwater's story, but they're no longer its defining chapter. Instead, they're a reminder of the transformative power of facing our fears, of the strength we find in community, and of the enduring human spirit that turns darkness into light, tragedy into triumph, and a summer of terror into a legacy of hope. The end? Perhaps, but at Camp Clearwater every ending is just another beginning, as each new generation discovers its own path through the wilderness, carrying forward the light of those who walked these woods before them. And so the story continues, as eternal as the mountains themselves, as fresh as tomorrow's dawn breaking over the lake.